In this verse, God lays down the manner in which these women may be lawfully married and the circumstances that permit such a marriage. And as for those of you who cannot afford to marry believing free women, then let them marry from among those whom your right hands possess your believing maidens. Islam gives preference to marriage with a free woman in cases where one has the means to do so. For freedom itself serves as a safeguard, instilling in a woman the awareness of how to protect her dignity and preserve the sanctity of her marriage. The term musanat, translated here as chaste women, does not in this instance signify married women, for marriage to those who are already wed has already been forbidden. Rather, it refers to free women who are fortified by their freedom, shielded by the dignity that liberty bestows upon the soul, and secured by the social guarantees it provides. A free woman belongs to a family, a household, a lineage. She is surrounded by those who sustain her, and she dreads disgrace. In her heart there is self-respect, and in her conscience there is nobility. She recoils from debasement and refuses to succumb to ignominy. None of this exists for a woman who is not free. She is not musana in the same sense. Even when she enters into marriage, remnants of her past bondage may linger in her soul, depriving her of the same sense of dignity, chastity, and pride that a free woman possesses. Moreover, she lacks the honour of a noble lineage that she fears to tarnish. Beyond all this, the offspring of such unions were, in that society, often regarded with a sense of inferiority compared to the children of free women, as the stain of servitude clung to them in one form or another. These were the prevailing social considerations in the community for which this verse was revealed. For all these reasons, Islam enjoined its free followers to marry only free women if they had the means to do so, making marriage to bondwomen a concession granted only in cases of necessity where waiting would impose undue hardship. Yet if such hardship arose, if a man feared distress, whether from the strain of deprivation or the allure of temptation, then religion would not stand as an obstacle, barring him from ease, comfort, and peace of mind. Islam, in its wisdom, permitted marriage to believing bondwomen who were under the ownership of others, and it set forth the one condition under which such a relationship could be sanctioned, a condition that mirrored the requirements laid out for the marriage of free women. First, they must be believers, from among those whom your right hands possess your believing maidens. Second, they must be given their due dower, as a rightful obligation owed to them personally, not to their masters. This is an entitlement that belongs solely to them, and give them their dowries as a duty. Third, this payment must take the form of a bridal gift, and intimacy must be established through lawful marriage, not through clandestine arrangements or fornication. Mukadana refers to a secret liaison with a single man, while sifa signifies indiscriminate relations with multiple partners. Chaste, not given to fornication nor taking secret lovers. At that time, Arabian society was familiar with such illicit unions among free women as Aisha, may God be pleased with her, has narrated. Likewise, among those who were not free, various forms of prostitution were widespread. Some of the noblemen of Quraysh would even send their slave girls to engage in such acts and bring back earnings for their masters. Abdullah ibn Ubay ibn Salul, the chief of the hypocrites in Medina and a leader of his people, had 4 such bondwomen who were forced into this vile trade for his profit. These were but remnants of the filth of Jahiliyyah, the age of ignorance, from which Islam came to uplift the Arabs, to purify them, and to elevate them as it sought to elevate all of humanity. Thus, Islam prescribed only one path for relations between free men, and these for ta'at, one that was identical to the path it had prescribed for the marriage of free women. It established marriage as the only lawful avenue, wherein a woman was exclusively bound to one man, with the purpose of building a home and a family, not as an arrangement where lust runs rampant like the instincts of beasts. And it placed wealth in the hands of men to be offered as a dowry, not as payment for clandestine liaisons or illicit unions. In this way, Islam purified these relationships, even within the realm of servitude, from the mire of Jahiliyyah, the mire into which humanity sinks whenever it regresses into Jahiliyyah. And it is this very mire that modern societies wade through today. For the banners of Jahiliyyah are raised high in every land, while the banner of Islam remains obscured. Yet before we move beyond this passage, we must pause to consider how the Quran expresses the nature of human relationships between the free and the enslaved in Islamic society, and how this religion approached the issue when it confronted the reality of servitude. The Quran does not refer to bondwomen as rikak, slaves, nor as jawari, concubines, nor as ima, maidservants. Instead, it calls them fata'at, young women. From among those whom your right hands possess, your believing maidens. Nor does it draw a racial distinction between the free and the enslaved, as was the norm in societies across the world at that time. Instead, it reminds them of their common origin and establishes the bonds of humanity and faith as the foundation of all relationships. And God knows best your faith. You are of one another. Furthermore, it does not refer to those who own them as masters, Sadat, but rather as their people. Then marry them with the permission of their people. And it does not decree that a woman's bridal gift belongs to her master. Rather, her dowry is a right that belongs to her alone. Thus it departs from the custom that all her earnings belong to her owner, for this is not a wage, it is a right of her union with a man, and give them their dowries as a duty. Nor does it degrade them by allowing them to be bartered as mere commodities for a price. Instead, it upholds their dignity, requiring that they enter into marriage with the intention of chastity and protection. Chaste, not given to fornication, nor taking secret lovers. Each of these nuances and expressions carries a profound sense of honour and elevation for these women, even while they remained in a temporary condition born of circumstantial necessity, one that did not in any way diminish their inherent human dignity. When we compare this honour to the prevailing attitudes of that era, wherein slaves were stripped of even the right to claim full humanity in the eyes of their so-called masters, along with all the rights that such humanity entails, we begin to grasp the magnitude of the shift that Islam introduced. And when we compare this noble treatment and its meticulous regulations to the conduct of conquering armies in this modern age of ignorance, when we recall the tales of comfort women and the unspeakable horrors inflicted by invading forces upon the women and daughters of the lands they overrun, we begin to appreciate the vast chasm between the dignity Islam enshrined and the degradation that modern barbarism continues to inflict. Finally, Islam decrees a reduced punishment for any of these fatat who commit fornication after they have been married, taking into account their circumstances, their heightened vulnerability to sin, their diminished resistance to temptation compared to free women, their weakened sense of honour and familial pride, both of which stir defiance in a free woman, and the economic and social disparities between them and their free counterparts. Islam acknowledges all these factors and, in its wisdom, prescribes for them a penalty that is half that of the free, believing woman. And if they commit indecency after they have been married, then their punishment shall be half that of free women. And it is understood that this half applies to a punishment that can be divided, namely the punishment of flogging. As for the punishment of stoning, it cannot be halved, for it is indivisible. Therefore, if a believing bondwoman who is married commits adultery, she shall receive half the punishment of a free, unmarried woman. However, the punishment for a bondwoman who is herself unmarried is a matter of scholarly dispute. Should it be the same, namely, half the punishment of a free, unmarried woman and administered by the ruler? Or should it be a disciplinary measure left to her master, falling short of half the prescribed punishment? This is a matter discussed in the books of jurisprudence. But here, in the shade of the Qur'an, we pause to observe how this divine code takes into account the realities of human life and the conditions of society, even as it lifts people upward along the ascending path of purity and righteousness. This religion considers indeed, as we have said, human realities without allowing them to become an excuse for sinking into the mire in the name of realism. God, in his infinite wisdom, has known the circumstances that surround the lives of slaves, circumstances that make a bondwoman, even if she is married, weaker in resisting temptation, and more prone to succumb to sin. He did not overlook this reality and decree for her the same punishment as for a free woman. Yet he also did not allow this reality to nullify all accountability and exempt her entirely from punishment. A just balance is maintained, one that takes into account all influences and all conditions. Likewise, Islam did not make the lower social status of a bondwoman a reason to double her punishment, as was the practice in the laws of pre-Islamic Jahiliyyah, which prevailed throughout the world. In those laws, punishment was mitigated for the noble classes and intensified for the lower ones. Under the renowned Roman legal code, the severity of punishment increased as the social class descended. It was decreed, if a man seduces a respectable widow or a virgin, his punishment if he belongs to a noble background shall be the confiscation of half his wealth. But if he comes from an ignoble background, his punishment shall be flogging and exile. Similarly, in the Hindu law codified by Manu, known as Manusmriti, it was stated that if a Brahmin deserved the death penalty, the ruler was not permitted to execute him, but could only shave his head. As for others, they were to be put to death. And if an outcast dared to raise his hand or a staff against a Brahmin, his hand was to be severed, and so on. Among the Jews, if a nobleman stole, they let him go, but if a commoner stole, they applied the legal punishment upon him. Then came Islam, to restore justice to its proper place, to hold every offender accountable while considering all aspects of reality. It decreed that the punishment for a bondwoman after marriage should be half that of a free woman before marriage. It did not grant her complete exemption from punishment as if her will were entirely annulled by her circumstances, for that would be an unrealistic denial of personal agency. Nor did it disregard her condition and punish her as if she were a free woman, for her situation differs from that of a free woman. Nor did it impose the harsh pre-Islamic penalties that discriminated against the weak while sparing the noble. To this day, the modern Jahiliyyah in America, in South Africa and elsewhere, still practices this racial discrimination, pardoning the noble whites for what they do not forgive the inferior coloured peoples. Jahiliyyah remains Jahiliyyah wherever it is found, and Islam remains Islam wherever it may be. The verse then concludes by stating that the permission to marry bondwomen is a concession for those who fear hardship or temptation. But if you persevere in patience, it is better for you. And God is most forgiving, most merciful. God does not wish to impose hardship upon his servants, nor to burden them beyond their capacity, nor to expose them to temptation. His religion, which he has chosen for them, calls them to rise, to transcend, to purify themselves, but all within the limits of their human nature, their inherent abilities, and their genuine needs. Hence, his law is easy and accommodating. It recognizes human disposition, understands human needs, and accounts for human necessities. However, this divine law does not call out to those who are sinking, urging them to remain in their degradation. Nor does it stand beside them in their mire, blessing their descent and glorifying their fall. Nor does it absolve them from striving towards purity, nor from bearing responsibility for failing to resist temptation. Here, the divine call is to patience until one gains the ability to marry free women, for they are more deserving of this sacred bond. It is they who should be honoured with marriage, who should build homes, who should bear noble offspring, who should oversee the upbringing of future generations, and who should safeguard the sanctity of marriage. But if one fears hardship, the hardship of abstinence or the overwhelming burden of temptation, then there is a concession, a chance to elevate the status of bondwomen by bestowing upon them the dignity of marriage. For they are your sisters in faith, and their guardians are your brethren. You all belong to the same community, bound by faith, and God knows best the depth of faith. Thus they are entitled to their dowries, granted to them as a divine obligation. This is marriage, not secret affairs or illicit unions, and they too are accountable if they fall into sin, yet with gentleness, with leniency, and with due consideration of their circumstances. And God is most forgiving, most merciful. Thus does the Qur'an conclude this passage, both concerning the necessity of marrying bondwomen in times of need and concerning the lighter punishment prescribed for them. And how fitting is this conclusion in both contexts, for God's forgiveness and mercy encompass every sin, and his compassion embraces every necessity. Finally, the Qur'an provides a comprehensive reflection upon these rulings, upon these divine regulations governing family life within the Islamic framework. It reminds the Muslim community of the noble purpose behind these laws, of the lofty heights to which they are meant to elevate society, lifting it from the abyss of pre-Islamic Jahiliyyah to the radiant summit of moral, psychological and social purity. Thus, the Quran unveils the true intent behind these divine ordinances, revealing what God desires for his people through this sacred path, and exposing the motives of those who follow their lusts and deviate from his way. God wants to make things clear to you and to guide you in the ways of those who came before you, and to turn to you in mercy, for God is all-knowing, most wise. And God wants to turn to you in forgiveness, but those who follow their lusts want you to drift far away from the right path. God wants to lighten your burdens, for humankind has been created weak. Thus does God, in his infinite grace, speak gently to his servants, revealing to them the wisdom behind his laws, allowing them to glimpse the beauty of his divine plan for their lives. For he honors them, yes, he honors them even as he elevates them to this sublime station. God wants to make things clear to you. God wants to unveil his wisdom before your eyes, so that you may see it, reflect upon it, and embrace it with open hearts and minds, for his laws are neither obscure riddles nor arbitrary commands without purpose. Rather, you are worthy of understanding their wisdom. You are worthy of being granted this insight. And this, too, is a mark of divine honor, an honor that only those who truly grasp the reality of God's sovereignty and the essence of human servitude can fully appreciate. And he guides you in the ways of those who came before you. For this divine path is the eternal path of faith, ordained for all believers throughout time. It is a path unchanging in its essence, unified in its principles, and unwavering in its goals. It is the path of the believing community past, present and future, the path of the one Ummah, bound together across the ages by the light of faith. Thus does the Qur'an unite those who are rightly guided towards God in every time and place, unveiling the singularity of God's way, eternal and unchanging across all ages and lands. It binds the Muslim community to the unbroken caravan of faith, travelling along the well-trodden path of divine guidance. It is a profound reminder, awakening in the believer an awareness of his true origin, his true nation, his true path. He belongs to that community of the faithful, bound not by geography or race, nor by the transient boundaries of nation and colour, but by the sacred bond of God's divine law, universal and ever-enduring, guiding the believers of every generation and every lineage. And he turns to you in mercy. For he exalted as he clarifies for you the way, guiding you to the example of those who came before, so that you may find his mercy, so that he may take you by the hand and lead you to repentance from error, from transgression, that he may smooth your path and aid you in your journey. And God is all-knowing, all-wise. From his infinite knowledge and wisdom do these laws emerge. From his boundless understanding do these commandments descend, knowledge of your inner selves, of your conditions, of what is best for you and what truly benefits you. Wisdom in the nature of the divine path and in its application alike. And God wishes to turn towards you, but those who follow their lusts wish that you incline towards them with a great inclination. In this brief yet weighty verse, the Quran unveils the stark contrast between what God wills for humanity through his divine law and what those who follow their base desires seek to impose upon them. Any who turn away from the path of God inevitably follow the whisperings of passion, for there is but one true path, the path of discipline, rectitude and commitment. All else is naught but whim obeyed, desire pursued, deviation and corruption, misguidance and ruin. What then does God seek for his creation when he makes clear his divine law and ordains his sacred decrees? He wills for them repentance. He wills for them guidance. He wills to protect them from pitfalls and calamities. He wills to raise them upwards upon the ascending path towards the loftiest heights. And what do those who follow their lusts seek? What is the aim of those who adorn for humanity paths and doctrines that God has neither sanctioned nor decreed? They wish for mankind to stray, a great straying from the straight path, from the ascending way, from the road of righteousness. And in this particular domain, where the preceding verses have spoken the domain of family life, the purification of society, the establishment of the one sanctified bond through which men and women may lawfully unite, and the prohibition of all other forms of union, condemning them in both heart and sight, what then does God will? And what do the followers of desire seek? As for what God wills, it has been made manifest in the verses that preceded. He wills order. He wills purity. He wills ease. He wills goodness for the Muslim community in all circumstances. And as for those who follow their desires, they seek to unshackle the instincts from every restraint, whether religious, moral, or social. They wish to let loose the raging fire of unbridled passion, unchecked and unrestrained, so that it may consume all before it. They seek to ignite a feverish storm of unquenched desire, one that leaves no heart at peace, no soul at rest, no home secure, no honour preserved, no family intact. They wish to reduce mankind to herds of cattle, where males and females intermingle without bounds, without inhibition, without law, subject only to the dominion of power, or the cunning of deception, or the tyranny of unbridled means. All this destruction, all this corruption, all this ruin in the name of freedom. Yet in this context, freedom is nothing but a hollow name for desire and impulse, a gilded mask for the basest of instincts. And this is the great deviation against which God warns the believers. For in every age they have exerted themselves, those who follow their desires, striving to pull the Muslim community back into the abyss of pre-Islamic Jahiliyyah, particularly in this realm of morality, where the true distinction of the believers lies. It is in this domain that the divine law has elevated them, setting them apart with a noble, sanctified way of life, one that is pure, upright, and luminous. And this is precisely what the pens of degradation and the instruments of corruption seek to demolish today, to shatter what remains of the moral barriers that stand between society and the unleashed bestiality that knows no restraint. There is no refuge from this descent into chaos except in the path of God. And it is only when a believing community upholds this path with unwavering resolve that humanity may yet be saved from the abyss. In closing, the Qur'an reminds us of God's mercy upon human frailty, reflected in the divine law and its injunctions. It is a law that eases burdens, a law decreed by the one who knows the weakness of his creation, a law founded upon ease, never upon hardship or oppression. God wishes to lighten your burden, for man was created weak. In this very domain where the preceding verses have legislated laws and decrees, the divine will to lighten burdens is clear. It is manifest in the recognition of innate human instincts, in the orderly regulation of their fulfillment, in the channeling of these energies into wholesome, lawful, and productive avenues within an atmosphere of purity and sanctity. Never does God demand of his servants the suppression of their nature to the point of hardship and torment. Nor does he leave them to descend into instinctual gratification without limit or restraint. The reality of freedom and the illusion of ease. Many assume that adherence to God's law, especially in matters of gender relations, is a burdensome struggle, while following the path of desire is ease and comfort. But this is a great illusion. To let loose desires without restraint, to seek pleasure for pleasure's sake, to cast aside duty and obligation, to reduce the sacred bond between man and woman to mere instinctual satisfaction, this may at first appear as freedom, as ease, as release. But in reality, it is hardship and toil and burden. Its consequences upon society, indeed upon every individual, are ruinous, painful, and crushing. One need only look to the realities of societies that have liberated themselves from the constraints of religion, morality, and modesty in their relationships between men and women. If there were still hearts that could tremble, they would tremble in terror. For it was this very anarchy of sexual relations that destroyed the ancient civilizations. It shattered the Greek civilization. It toppled the Roman Empire. It obliterated the Persian Empire. And this very same anarchy is now dismantling the modern Western civilization. Its effects have already surfaced, fully manifest in France, which was the first to plunge into this abyss. And now, the same signs of decay are appearing in America, Sweden, Britain, and beyond, spreading like a slow but certain disease through the very heart of modern civilization. Indeed, France was among the earliest to feel the consequences of this moral decay, leaving it weakened. Kneeling in every war it has fought since 1870, spiralling ever further towards inevitable collapse. And the signs of complete disintegration after the First World War have begun to emerge with unmistakable clarity. The foremost affliction that befell the French, an affliction that took root in their indulgence of base desires, was the gradual decline of their physical strength, a decline that crept upon them day by day. Their ceaseless agitation enfeebled their nerves, their enslavement to passions eroded their patience and endurance, and the rampant spread of secret diseases ravaged their health. From the dawn of the 20th century, French military authorities have repeatedly been compelled to lower the physical and health standards required for enlistment at intervals of just a few years, because the number of young men who met the former criteria steadily dwindled. As time passed, such men became a rarity in the nation. This indeed is a telling measure akin in accuracy and reliability to a thermometer in the assessment of fever, revealing the steady decline of the nation's physical vigour. One of the principal causes of this deterioration is the scourge of venereal disease. A telling indication of this is the fact that during the first 2 years of the First World War, 75,000 soldiers had to be discharged and sent to hospitals due to syphilis alone. In one single barracks of moderate size, 242 soldiers were found to be afflicted with this disease at the same time. Imagine, by God, the plight of this wretched nation at a moment when it stood precariously at the edge of life and death, when it was in dire need of the utmost effort from each of its warriors for its survival and continuity. Every franc in its treasury was to be guarded with utmost care. Every ounce of strength, every moment of time, and every available means had to be devoted to defence. Yet, at such a critical juncture, thousands of its young men, those who should have been the bulwark of its survival, were rendered unfit for battle, not by wounds inflicted by the enemy, but by their own surrender to the temptations of fleeting pleasure. And as though this loss in manpower were not calamity enough, the nation squandered a portion of its wealth and resources in treating them at a time when it could scarcely afford such waste. A distinguished French physician, Dr. Leria, has stated that every year 30,000 people perish in France due to syphilis and its numerous associated diseases. This affliction, he asserts, is the deadliest scourge upon the French nation, surpassed only by tuberculosis. And this is but the toll exacted by one of many such clandestine ailments. The French nation is dwindling in number, its population steadily declining at an alarming rate. The ease with which sexual impulses are gratified, the chaos of unbridled relationships, and the widespread practice of discarding unborn children and newborns, these factors leave no room for the establishment of families, no foundation for stability, no sense of responsibility for the offspring born of transient unions. Consequently, marriage is rare, childbirth rarer still, and France tumbles ever downward toward the abyss. At present, a mere 7 or 8 per thousand of France's men and women enter into marriage. From this meagre statistic, one may deduce the vast multitude of those who remain unmarried. And even among those few who do enter matrimony, seldom do they do so with the intention of safeguarding their virtue or committing themselves to a life of righteousness. Instead, they pursue every conceivable aim save that of moral fortification. Indeed, it has become common practice for a man to wed merely to legitimize a child his bride bore before marriage, to make the illegitimate legitimate. Paul Bureau has chronicled the prevailing custom among the French working class, wherein a woman secures from her paramour a solemn pledge prior to their marriage that he will legally recognize as his own any child she has conceived before their union. A woman once appeared before the court in the city of Seine and testified, "I informed my husband before marriage that I sought wedlock for no reason other than to legitimize the children I had borne from my previous relations with him. As for cohabiting with him as a wife, that was never my intention, neither then nor now. Thus, on the very evening of our wedding, I withdrew from him, and I have not seen him since, for I never intended to share a conjugal life with him. The dean of a prestigious college in Paris once confided to Paul Bureau, "The majority of young men today marry with the intent of having a harlot in their own home. For 10 years or more, they roam freely in the valleys of debauchery. Then, wearied by that vagrant and unsettled life, they seek marriage not to embrace the sanctity of family, but to combine the tranquility of home with the continued indulgence in extramarital affairs. Thus has France deteriorated. Thus has it been vanquished in every war it has waged. Thus does it fade from the stage of civilization and day by day from the stage of existence itself until the immutable law of God is fulfilled. A law that never fails, though its workings may at times appear slow to the impatient observer. And what of the nations that still seem youthful, where the signs of ruin have not yet become manifest? Let us consider an example. A journalist who recently visited Sweden writes of the country's freedom of love, its material prosperity, and the socialist safeguards it provides for its people. He then poses a question. If the pinnacle of our aspirations is to attain for our people such economic success, to eliminate class distinctions through socialist policies, and to guarantee the citizen against every conceivable hardship in life, if this is the shining dream for which we strive with all our might in Egypt, shall we also accept its inevitable consequences? Shall we embrace the darker side of this utopian society? Shall we welcome freedom of love with all its perilous effects upon the family structure? Let us speak in numbers. Despite all these incentives for stability and family formation, Sweden's population graph inclines toward extinction. The state provides marriage grants to young women and guarantees free care for their children up to university graduation. Yet still, the Swedish family moves toward ceasing reproduction altogether. This is paralleled by a continuous decline in marriage rates and a steady increase in illegitimate births. It is worth noting that 20% of Swedish adults, both men and women, never marry at all. The industrial era and the socialist order in Sweden began around 1870. At that time, the percentage of unwed mothers stood at 7%. By 1920, it had risen to 16%. Subsequent statistics are scarce, but there is little doubt the trend has continued upward. Scientific studies on free love in Sweden reveal that men commence extramarital sexual relations at 18, while girls do so at 15. By the age of 21, 95% of young Swedish men have had such relations. For those who demand empirical proof of the consequences of sexual freedom, let us examine the details. 7% of these affairs occur with fiancés, 35% with lovers, and 58% with casual acquaintances. And if we analyze women's premarital sexual relations before the age of 20, we find that 3% are with husbands-to-be, 27% with fiancés, and 64% with transient partners. Scientific research tells us that 80% of Swedish women have engaged in full sexual relations before marriage, while 20% remained unmarried. Naturally, this freedom of love has led to delayed marriages and prolonged engagements, accompanied by a rise in the number of illegitimate children, as has been observed. The inevitable consequence of all this is the growing disintegration of the family. The people of Sweden defend freedom of love by asserting that Swedish society regards marital infidelity with contempt, just as any other civilized society does. And this indeed is true, we do not deny it. But they cannot defend the trend toward the extinction of progeny, nor the alarming increase in divorce rates. Sweden has the highest divorce rate in the world. According to statistics compiled by the Swedish Ministry of Social Affairs, one divorce occurs for every 6 or 7 marriages. The rate was once low, but has continued to rise. In 1925, there were 26 divorces per 100,000 inhabitants. By 1952, this number had climbed to 104, and in 1954 it rose further to 114. The reason, we are told, is that 30% of marriages occur under coercion forced by circumstances after a girl has conceived out of wedlock. And marriage dictated by necessity does not by its very nature endure as ordinary marriage does. Divorce is further encouraged by the fact that Swedish law places no obstacles in the way of separation. If both spouses decide upon divorce, the process is exceedingly simple. Even if only one partner seeks to dissolve the union, any minor justification suffices for the courts to grant it. And if the freedom of love is firmly established in Sweden, there is yet another freedom, that the majority of Swedes enjoy the freedom not to believe in God. Sweden has witnessed a sweeping movement of liberation from the authority of the Church, a phenomenon that prevails in Norway and Denmark as well. Educators in schools and institutes actively champion this freedom, instilling it in the minds of the young. And thus, the younger generation deviates from the path. This is a novel affliction that threatens the youth of Sweden and the rest of Scandinavia. Bereft of faith, they drift toward moral decline, toward addiction, whether to drugs or to intoxicants. It has been estimated that some 175,000 children belong to families with an alcoholic father, amounting to 10% of all children in families. Teenage alcoholism is on the rise, doubling in magnitude. The number of adolescents, aged 15 to 17, arrested by Swedish police for severe intoxication is now 3 times what it was 15 years ago. The habit of drinking among both boys and girls progresses from bad to worse, leading inevitably to a dreadful reality. 1 in every 10 Swedish youths reaching puberty suffers from mental disturbances. Swedish doctors report that 50% of their patients suffer from psychological disorders accompanying their physical ailments. And undoubtedly the unchecked indulgence in the liberty of disbelief will only exacerbate these psychological deviations, accelerate family disintegration, and draw them ever closer to the abyss of demographic extinction. And the state of affairs in America is no better. Ominous signs continue to unfold, yet the American nation, in its apparent vigor, pays them no heed. But the forces of destruction are at work within its very core, despite its outward splendor, and they work swiftly, foretelling an imminent collapse from within regardless of the dazzling facade. It has been discovered that those who sell America's and Britain's military secrets to their enemies do so not out of financial need, but due to sexual perversion, an affliction born of the rampant moral anarchy prevailing in society. Years ago, American law enforcement uncovered a vast network spread across multiple cities, composed of lawyers and doctors, the very elite of the intellectual class, whose purpose was to facilitate divorce by entrapping husbands and wives in acts of infidelity. Some states still require proof of adultery for the dissolution of marriage, and so this syndicate would contrive situations wherein an unsuspecting spouse would be caught in the act, thus providing the grounds for separation desired by the aggrieved party. It is also well known that certain agencies specialize in tracking down runaway wives and absconding husbands. In such a society, a husband departs his home uncertain whether he will return to find his wife still there, or whether she has fled with a lover. Likewise, a wife does not know whether the husband who left in the morning will return to her, or whether he will be lured away by a woman more beautiful or more captivating than she. In such a world, households exist in a state of ceaseless anxiety, leaving no nerve at ease. And finally, the President of the United States declares that 6 out of every 7 young Americans are now unfit for military service due to the moral decay in which they live. More than a quarter of a century ago, an American magazine wrote, "3 satanic forces encircle our world today, fanning the flames of depravity among the people of the earth. The first is the obscene and shameless literature, ever increasing in vulgarity and popularity since the First World War at an astonishing pace. The second is the cinema, which not only inflames the passions of carnal love, but also provides practical lessons in its pursuit. The third is the moral decline among women in general, manifesting in their attire, or rather in their nudity, their indulgence in smoking, and their unrestricted mingling with men without restraint or commitment. These 3 vices continue to expand and spread with the passage of days. and their inevitable consequence will be the downfall of Christian civilization and its ultimate extinction. If we do not curb their tyranny, it is inevitable that our history will mirror that of Rome and the nations that followed in its wake, those civilizations that succumbed to ruin and annihilation through their indulgence in desires and passions, drowned in wine and women, lost in the distractions of dance, revelry, and song. What has happened since then? America did not restrain the surge of these three forces. On the contrary, she surrendered entirely to them. And now she marches down the very path once trodden by Rome. Another journalist, attempting to diminish concerns over the moral corruption of our own youth, writes of the wave of juvenile delinquency sweeping through America, Britain, and France. A wave of crime has spread among American adolescents. The governor of New York State has declared that addressing this moral decline will be his foremost priority in the state's reform agenda. He has established farms, correctional institutions, and sports clubs in an effort to rehabilitate the youth. However, he has announced that tackling drug addiction, particularly rampant among university students, including substances such as hashish and cocaine, does not fall within his program and will instead be left to the health authorities. Meanwhile, in England, incidents of sexual assault against women and young girls in rural areas have surged in recent years. In most cases, the perpetrator is a teenage boy. In some instances, the assailant strangles his victim, leaving her lifeless, so that she cannot reveal his identity or recognize him if presented before the police. 2 months ago, an old man was on his way to the village when he beheld, beneath the shade of a tree by the roadside, a boy engaged in an act of lewdness with a girl. Drawing closer, the old man struck the boy with his staff, rebuking and admonishing him, saying, "Such deeds are not to be committed in public." Yet the boy, instead of heeding the admonition, rose in anger and kicked the old man in the stomach with all his might. The man collapsed to the ground, but the boy did not relent. He struck him again, this time in the head with the sole of his shoe, and then, with cruel persistence, he continued to kick him until the old man's skull was crushed. The boy was but 15 years of age, and the girl but 13. And thus has the American Committee of 14, tasked with observing the moral condition of the land, reported that 90% of the American populace was afflicted with deadly venereal diseases, this even before the advent of modern antibiotics such as penicillin and streptomycin. Judge Lindsay of Denver wrote that 1 in every 2 marriages ended in divorce. And the great scientist Alexis Carrel, in his book Man the Unknown, observed, "Though we are on the verge of eradicating infantile diarrhea, tuberculosis, diphtheria, typhoid fever and the like, in their place have emerged the diseases of corruption and moral decay. A great number of afflictions now plague the nervous system and the faculties of the mind. In certain states of America, the number of the insane confined in asylums exceeds that of all the patients in other hospitals combined. And like madness, nervous disorders and mental frailty are on the rise, becoming among the most active forces in bringing misery to individuals and destruction to families. Indeed, mental corruption poses a far greater threat to civilization than do the infectious diseases that have so preoccupied physicians and health experts until now. This, then, is but a glimpse of the price paid by a misguided humanity lost in its modern jahiliyyah, heedless of the divine path and enslaved to those who pursue nothing but their passions. For the way of God is one of ease, designed to lighten the burden upon man who is weak by nature. It safeguards him from his impulses, protects him from his desires, and guides him to the path of safety, leading him toward repentance, righteousness, and purity. And God wishes to turn to you in mercy, whereas those who follow but their own lusts would have you deviate into a deviation most grave. God wishes to lighten your burden, for man has been created weak. On financial transactions in the Islamic society. The second section of this discourse turns to the realm of financial dealings within the Muslim society, setting forth the principles that govern such transactions, ensuring purity in dealings among individuals. It reaffirms the right of women, as it does for men, to own property and to earn wealth, each according to their share. And finally, it addresses the system of wala, a form of allegiance and contractual bond known in pre-Islamic times, and retained in the early period of Islam, eventually abolishing new agreements of this nature and restricting inheritance solely to kin. O you who have attained to faith, do not consume one another's wealth wrongfully, unless it be through trade by mutual consent. And do not kill yourselves, for indeed God is ever merciful to you. But whoever does this in aggression and injustice, we shall cast him into the fire, and that for God is ever easy. If you avoid the gravest of sins that you are forbidden, we shall efface your lesser misdeeds and cause you to enter a noble abode. And do not covet that whereby God has favoured some of you above others. Men shall have a share of what they have earned, and women shall have a share of what they have earned. And ask God of his bounty, for indeed God is ever aware of all things. And for everyone, we have appointed rightful heirs to inherit from what parents and close relatives leave behind. As for those with whom you have made covenants, give them their due. Indeed, God is ever a witness to all things. This is but one link in the chain of moral cultivation, and one link in the chain of legislation, for in the divine method, tabiyah, nurturing the soul, and tashri, legislation, are inseparable, interwoven, and complementary. It is a system wherein law is designed with the refinement of character in mind, just as it is tailored to regulate the practical affairs of life. The commands that accompany legislation serve not only to instill a sense of piety in the hearts of individuals, but also to ensure the sincere and conscientious implementation of the law born out of an awareness of its gravity and the undeniable wisdom it carries. Thus, both the law and the guidance that accompanies it are intended to bind the heart to God, imbuing it with a deep awareness of the divine source of this all-encompassing system in both its legal and moral dimensions. This is the distinguishing feature of the divinely ordained way of life, a harmony that rectifies both the external reality of society and the internal condition of the human conscience simultaneously. And so, in this passage we find a prohibition upon believers from consuming one another's wealth unjustly, a clarification of the lawful means of acquiring wealth, namely, trade conducted with mutual consent, a depiction of wrongful financial dealings as a form of self-destruction, ruinous and fatal, a warning of the torment of the hereafter and the flames of hell for those who persist in such wrongdoing. Yet alongside this stern admonition, there is ease, mercy, and the promise of divine forgiveness, God's assurance that he will lighten the burden of human weakness and forgive lapses and shortcomings. Moreover, we find in this passage a spiritual training, a call to cleanse the soul of envy and to refrain from yearning for the worldly distinctions that God has granted some over others. Instead, the believer is directed to turn to God, the true bestower of all gifts, and to ask him alone for his bounty. This counsel is given even as the verse establishes the rightful share of men in what they earn and the rightful share of women in what they earn, each granted their due by the wisdom of the Almighty, who is in all matters all-knowing. Likewise, the decree regarding the bonds of wala, ensuring that those with whom one has entered into such covenants receive their due, is accompanied by the solemn reminder that God is ever a witness to all things. These are poignant, soul-stirring touches that accompany the law guidances that shape the moral conscience, crafted by the one who knows the human being in his entirety, his psychological composition, the pathways of his soul, and the many inclinations of his nature. O you who have attained to faith, do not consume one another's wealth wrongfully, unless it be through trade by mutual consent, and do not kill yourselves, for indeed God is ever merciful to you. But whoever does this in aggression and injustice, we shall cast him into the fire, and that for God is ever easy. Here, the believers are called upon by name, and they are forbidden from devouring one another's wealth unjustly. O you who have attained to faith, do not consume one another's wealth wrongfully. This suggests a purification, a cleansing of any remnants of pre-Islamic corruption that may have lingered in the Muslim society. It is a call that stirs the conscience of the believers, shaking them awake with the solemn Ya ayyuha alladina amanu, O you who have attained to faith, reminding them of the responsibilities that faith entails. For to consume wealth wrongfully encompasses all transactions that God has neither sanctioned nor permitted: fraud, bribery, gambling, hoarding necessities to drive up prices, and all manner of unlawful trade, foremost among them riba, usury. The difference is vast between the nature of commercial transactions and usurious dealings, first and foremost, and between the services that commerce renders to industry and the masses, and the affliction that usury inflicts upon both commerce and society. Commerce is a beneficial intermediary between industry and the consumer. It promotes and markets goods, thereby improving them and facilitating their accessibility. It is a service rendered to both parties, and its profit is derived from this service profit that depends on skill and effort, and that remains subject to both gain and loss. Usury, on the other hand, stands in stark opposition to all of this. It burdens industry with interest charges that are added to the original costs, and it weighs heavily upon commerce and the consumer alike by imposing these interest payments upon industry. Moreover, as has been clearly manifested in the capitalist system at its zenith, usury directs industry and investment toward ends that take no heed of the well-being of industry itself or the needs of the consuming masses. Rather, its primary objective is the maximization of profit in order to meet the obligations of industrial loans, even if this leads to the consumption of luxury goods while necessities remain out of reach, even if it results in investments in the most degrading of ventures, those that inflame base desires and corrode the very fabric of human dignity. Above all, usury ensures a perpetual profit for capital without exposing it to the risk of loss, as is the case in commerce, and with minimal reliance on human effort, the exertion of which is, in contrast, an intrinsic aspect of trade. This is but a portion of the long list of indictments against the usurious system, an indictment so damning that it demands the pronouncement of a death sentence upon it, just as Islam has decreed. It is this resemblance on the surface between usury and commerce that perhaps necessitated the clarifying exception. Unless it be trade by mutual consent among you, which follows immediately after the prohibition of devouring wealth through falsehood. Even if, grammatically, this is considered an interrupted exception, as grammarians say, its placement here is profoundly significant. And do not kill yourselves, for indeed, God is ever merciful toward you. This injunction follows immediately after the prohibition of devouring wealth through falsehood, thereby alluding to the destructive consequences that arise when wealth is consumed unlawfully within a society. It is, in essence, an act of collective self-destruction. God, in his mercy, seeks to protect the believers from this ruin by forbidding them from engaging in such practices. And indeed it is so. No society that allows the proliferation of illegitimate means of acquiring wealth, whether through usury, fraud, gambling, hoarding, deception, embezzlement, bribery, theft, or the sale of what ought not to be sold, such as honour, conscience, integrity and faith, no society in which these means are rampant, whether in past ages of Jahiliyyah or in modern ones, can escape the doom it brings upon itself. It is destined to self-destruct and plunge into the abyss of ruin. God, in his mercy, desires to save those who believe from this devastating fate, a fate that not only destroys material existence but also shatters souls. This is but one facet of his will to lighten the burden upon them and to rescue them from their inherent human frailty, which leads them astray when they abandon divine guidance in favor of the directives of those who seek to lure them into the pursuit of base desires. Following this comes the dire warning of torment in the hereafter, a warning directed at those who consume wealth unlawfully, oppressing and wronging others. They are threatened with the punishment of the hereafter after already being forewarned of the destruction and suffering that unlawful economic practices bring upon them in this world. And whoever does this in aggression and injustice, we shall cast him into the fire, and that is easy for God. Thus does the divine law encompass the human soul from all directions, both in this world and in the hereafter, by legislating for it and guiding it, by establishing within it a vigilant guard that is ever alert in adhering to divine directives and fulfilling legal obligations. It also places upon the collective society the responsibility of mutual oversight, for society as a whole bears the burden of accountability. If it allows injustice and false dealings to persist, then God's decree of destruction shall inevitably befall it, both in this world and the next. And that is easy for God. Nothing can obstruct his command, nor can any barrier prevent his decree from coming to pass. It does not falter. Whenever its causes are present, its fulfillment is certain. In contrast, for those who abstain from the major sins, among which is the unlawful consumption of wealth, God promises his mercy, his forgiveness, and his overlooking of their lesser faults. This is in consideration of their human frailty, which he, in his infinite wisdom, knows well. It is a facilitation for them, a reassurance for their hearts, and an aid to help them guard themselves against the fire by avoiding the great and grievous sins. If you shun the major sins that you are forbidden, we shall remit your lesser misdeeds, and we shall admit you to a noble entrance. Oh, how generous this religion is, and how gentle is its path! For all its call to elevation and purity, to virtue and cleanliness, to obedience and discipline, despite all the obligations, limits, commands, and prohibitions that it establishes to cultivate righteous souls and build a wholesome society, this faith does not overlook the inherent weakness and limitations of human nature. It does not impose upon man beyond his capacity, nor does it disregard the inclinations of his being and the constraints of his disposition. It does not feign jahiliyyah of the intricate pathways of his soul and the myriad turns of his psyche. Thus, it maintains a perfect balance between obligation and ability, between aspiration and necessity, between impulse and restraint, between command and prohibition, between encouragement and warning, between the terrifying menace of punishment for transgression and the profound hope of mercy and pardon. For this religion, it is sufficient that the human soul turns earnestly towards God, that it sincerely dedicates itself to this devotion, and that it exerts its utmost effort in obedience and seeking his pleasure. Beyond that, there is the infinite mercy of God, his mercy that embraces human frailty, that extends kindness toward human shortcomings, that accepts repentance, pardons failure, forgives sins, and opens the gates of return for those who seek him, welcoming them with honor and grace. The sign of this utmost effort, this sincere striving, is the avoidance of the great and manifest sins, those transgressions that are undeniable in their enormity, those that no soul commits in jahiliyyah or without awareness. To succumb to such sins is proof that the soul has not truly exerted itself in the struggle against wrongdoing, that it has not exhausted its strength in resisting temptation. Yet even such sins, so long as repentance is sincere, are forgiven by God's mercy, the mercy that he has ordained upon himself. Did he not say, "And those who, when they commit an indecency or wrong themselves, remember God and seek forgiveness for their sins, and who forgives sins but God, and do not persist in their wrongdoing while they know, and he counted them among the righteous." What is being addressed here, however, is the immediate remission of misdeeds and sins by God himself, provided that the great transgressions are avoided. This is his promise, and this is his glad tidings to the believers. As for what constitutes the major sins, various traditions enumerate different examples, none of which claim to be exhaustive. Each hadith lists a selection of sins relevant to the occasion it addresses. Yet no believer finds difficulty in recognizing the major sins, even though their number and nature may vary across societies and generations. And here is a story of Umar ibn al-Khattab. May God be pleased with him, the ever scrupulous, the one whose heart trembled at the thought of sin. Yet despite his hypersensitivity to wrongdoing, Islam refined his conscience, balanced his keen sense of justice, and instilled within him a scale that measured with perfect precision as he navigated the affairs of society and the souls of men. Ibn Jarir said, Yaqub ibn Ibrahim narrated to me, saying, Ibn Ulayya told us on the authority of Ibn Awn from Al-Hasan that a group of people questioned Abdullah ibn Amr in Egypt, saying, "We observe certain commands in the Book of God exalted in might. Is he ordained to be acted upon, yet they are neglected? We wish to present our concerns to the commander of the faithful regarding this matter." Thus they set out to meet him, travelling alongside him. When they encountered Umar, may God be pleased with him, Umar asked his son, "When did you arrive?" He replied, "Such and such time ago." He then said, "Did you come with permission?" At this, Abdullah ibn Amr hesitated. he did not know how to respond. Abdullah ibn Amr then said, "Some men approached me in Egypt, saying, 'We see matters in the book of God that were commanded to be upheld, yet they are not practiced. We wish to meet with the commander of the faithful regarding them.' Umar told him, 'Gather them for me.' Thus I assembled them before him." Abu On said, "I think he gathered them in a hall. Then Umar took hold of the nearest among them and said, 'I adjure you by God, and by the right of Islam upon you, have you read the entire Qur'an?' The man replied, 'Yes.' Then Umar asked, 'Have you fully encompassed its meaning in yourself?' The man answered, 'By God, no.' Had he said yes, Umar would have refuted him. Then Umar continued, 'Have you embodied it in your vision? Have you embodied it in your speech? Have you embodied it in your actions?' And so he proceeded, questioning them one by one until he had confronted them all. Then he exclaimed, 'May Umar's mother be bereaved of him. Do you demand of me that I compel all people to abide by the book of God in its entirety? Our sustainer has already decreed that we shall have our shortcomings.' Then he recited, 'If you avoid the major sins that you are forbidden, we will absolve you of your lesser misdeeds.' Qur'an 4:31. Then he asked them, 'Has anyone in Medina learned of what you have done, or has anyone heard of your intent?' They replied, 'No.' To which he said, 'Had they known, I would have made an example of you.' Thus did Umar, ever scrupulous, ever profoundly sensitive, govern hearts and society. The Qur'an had refined his perception and endowed him with a delicate balance of judgment. Our sustainer has already decreed that we shall have our shortcomings, and we shall be none other than what our sustainer has known us to be. What truly matters is the sincerity of intent, the striving for righteousness, the earnest endeavour to fulfil our obligations, and the exertion of effort in this pursuit. It is a balance of seriousness and ease, of rigour and moderation. In the context of wealth and its circulation among the community, the discourse transitions to the relationships and transactions between men and women and to the bonds of allegiance that were once linked to the general system of inheritance, whose details had already been expounded at the beginning of this surah. And do not covet that by which God has favoured some of you over others. To men belongs a share of what they have earned, and to women belongs a share of what they have earned. And ask God of his bounty. Indeed, God is ever knowing of all things, and for all we have appointed heirs to what is left by parents and relatives, and those with whom you have made a pledge, give them their share. Indeed, God is ever a witness over all things. Qur'an 4:32-33. This verse lays down a general prohibition against coveting that which God has granted to some believers over others, whatever form this favour may take. Whether in rank and position, in innate capacities and talents, in wealth and worldly possessions, or in any other aspect of life where differences in fortune arise. Instead, individuals are directed to turn to God, seeking his bounty rather than dissipating their souls in futile yearning for what others possess. This command serves as a safeguard against the corrosive emotions of envy and resentment, against the bitterness of grievance and discontent, or against the despair that arises from feelings of deprivation and inadequacy. It prevents the heart from being consumed by suspicion, whether against God's wisdom or against the justice of his decree. For such thoughts are the true affliction, the ruinous calamity that robs the soul of its peace, engenders anxiety and distress, and squanders one's energy in malignant emotions and harmful pursuits. By directing one's aspirations toward God's grace, the believer is guided toward the true source of all blessings, the one whose treasures are inexhaustible, whose generosity is boundless, and who is never burdened by the multitudes that seek his favour. In this there is a refuge of tranquillity and hope, a wellspring of purposeful striving, inspiring one to seek the means of sustenance rather than to languish in bitterness and envy. Though the verse establishes a universal principle, its placement within the broader discourse, along with certain narrations regarding its revelation, suggests a particular application, namely, the differentiation in the shares of inheritance allotted to men and women. This distinction, while crucial in regulating the relationship between the two halves of humanity and fostering harmony and mutual fulfillment, does not negate the broader significance of the verse. For this reason, the exegetes have conveyed both meanings, the universal and the particular. Imam Ahmad narrated from Sufyan, from Abu Najih, from Mujahid, who said, Salama said, O Messenger of God, the men go forth to battle, but we do not, and we receive only half the inheritance. Then God revealed, and do not covet that by which God has favoured some of you over others. A similar narration was recorded by Ibn Abi Hatim, Ibn Jarir, Ibn Mardawayh and Al-Hakim in his Mustadrak, from the report of Al-Tawari, from Abu Najih, from Mujahid. Salama said, O Messenger of God, we do not fight, and thus are not martyred, nor do we inherit as men do. Thus the verse was revealed. Then God further revealed, Indeed, I do not allow the deeds of any among you to be lost, whether male or female. Qur'an 3:195. Al-Suddi narrated regarding this verse, Some men said, We wish that our reward be doubled compared to that of women, just as our inheritance shares are twice theirs. Meanwhile, the women said, We wish that we receive the same reward as the martyrs, for we are unable to fight. But if combat were prescribed for us, we would surely fight. But God did not grant them this, rather he instructed them, Ask me of my bounty. He meant not the wealth of this world. A similar narration is attributed to Qatada. Other reports convey a more general interpretation of the verse. Ali ibn Abi Talha reported from Ibn Abbas, A man should not say, I wish I had the wealth and family of so-and-so. God forbade such longing, but commanded instead, Ask me of my bounty. Al-Hasan, Muhammad, Ibn Sirin, Atta, and Al-Dahak conveyed similar meanings. In the early interpretations, we glimpse echoes of pre-Islamic notions regarding the roles of men and women. We also detect undertones of rivalry, perhaps stirred by the newfound rights and freedoms Islam had granted women rights, aligned with its broader principle of honouring humanity in both genders, ensuring fairness to every individual, every class and every soul, even against its own inclinations. Yet Islam was not championing men over women, nor women over men. Rather, it was implementing its comprehensive vision in its entirety for the sake of humanity, for the sake of the Muslim community, for the sake of righteousness and justice in their most complete, all-encompassing forms. And when one studies the Islamic methodology in its entirety, beginning with its fundamental principles and then examining the specific aspects that govern the relationship between the two complementary halves of the human soul, there remains no room for that old controversy, narrated in various reports, nor for the modern-day debates that fill the idle hours of those who have little else to occupy them. Indeed, such discussions often become so loud and pervasive that they sometimes drown out even the voices of those who are sincere and earnest in their pursuits. It is sheer folly to depict this matter as though it were a fierce battle between the sexes where each side measures victories and defeats against the other. And it is no less absurd when certain serious-minded writers attempt to diminish the worth of woman, vilifying her and attributing every flaw and failing to her, whether under the pretext of defending Islam or in the name of research and analysis. For this is not a battle at all. It is rather a matter of harmony, distribution and complementarity, and above all, of absolute justice as ordained by God. Indeed, such battles may arise in societies steeped in Jahiliyyah, societies that craft their laws according to their own whims, dictated by immediate material interests or by the dominance of certain classes, families or individuals. It is in such societies that we witness the oppression of women, whether due to a fundamental misunderstanding of human nature and the respective roles of the sexes in life, or due to economic motives such as the deprivation of working women from equal pay for equal labour, or the unjust distribution of inheritance, or the denial of a woman's right to dispose of her wealth, as is the case in many of today's so-called modern societies of Jahiliyyah. But in the divine system of Islam, there is no such battle. There is no competition over the fleeting illusions of this world. There is no place for campaigns against women, nor for campaigns against men, no room for attempts to denigrate or vilify either sex, or to hunt for their faults and expose their shortcomings. Nor is there any justification for the misconception that the natural diversity in the formation and characteristics of men and women does not correspond to a diversity in their respective responsibilities and roles. Indeed, Such notions arise from sheer misunderstanding both of the Islamic methodology and of the fundamental functions assigned to each gender by the Creator. Let us reflect upon the question of jihad, the struggle in the path of God and martyrdom, and the share that women have in it and in the reward that it brings. This was a concern that occupied the minds of the righteous women of that blessed generation, the generation that devoted itself wholly to the hereafter, even as it fulfilled its duties in this transient world. Similarly, let us consider the question of inheritance and the respective shares allotted to men and women, an issue that preoccupied some men and women in the past, and which continues to preoccupy many in our own time. God has not decreed upon women the obligation of jihad, nor has He forbidden it to them, nor has He barred them from it when necessity demands their presence in the battlefield, in cases where men alone cannot suffice. Indeed, the chronicles of Islamic history recount instances of individual women who fought not merely as healers or providers of provisions, but as warriors in their own right. Yet such cases were rare and exceptional, dictated by specific needs and circumstances. They were never the norm. In any case, God has not made jihad an obligation upon women as He has upon men. The reason for this is simple. Woman gives birth to the very men who wage jihad. She is created by her entire being, both physically and psychologically, to bring men into this world, to nurture them for struggle and for life itself. And in this field, she is more capable and more beneficial. She is more capable because every cell in her body has been designed both biologically and psychologically for this task. It is not merely a matter of external physical attributes. Rather, it is a function of the very essence of her being, determined from the moment of conception, when the fertilized egg is divinely decreed to be either male or female. From that point onward, her entire physiological and psychological makeup follows a distinct path, leading to the visible characteristics of her womanhood, and beyond that, to the profound emotional and psychological dimensions of her nature. And she is more beneficial when one considers the long-term welfare of the Ummah, for war claims the lives of men while sparing women, leaving behind those who can replenish the population and restore what was lost. This is not the case when war claims both men and women in equal measure, or when it claims women and spares men. For in the Islamic system, when necessity demands that every permissible recourse be employed, a single man can ensure that 4 women continue to bear children, thus replenishing the void left by battle within a short span of time. But no number of men, no matter how many, can enable a single woman to bear more than she naturally can, nor can they compensate for the loss of women in society. This is but one of the countless aspects of divine wisdom in exempting women from the obligation of jihad. Behind it lie many other considerations relating to the moral fabric of society, the natural order of human composition, and the preservation of the essential characteristics of both sexes, matters that require a more detailed study beyond the scope of this discussion. As for reward and divine recompense, God has assured both men and women alike that the path to excellence is open to all, each according to what has been entrusted to them. It is sufficient for every individual to excel within their divinely assigned role to attain the highest ranks in the sight of God. The matter of inheritance follows the same principle. At first glance, one might perceive an apparent preference for men in the general rule. Unto the male is the portion of 2 females. But this superficial observation quickly dissolves upon closer scrutiny, revealing instead a harmonious balance in the respective roles and responsibilities of men and women. For the principle of gain being proportionate to liability, al-gum bil-gum, is firmly established in the divine order. The man is obligated to provide a dowry, mahr, for the woman at the outset of marriage, whereas she is not required to give him anything in return. He must provide for her and for their children, while she is entirely exempt from this duty, even if she possesses wealth of her own. If he fails in his financial obligations, he may even be imprisoned for his negligence. He is also accountable for blood money, diyah, and compensations for injuries, in solidarity with his family, while the woman is exempt from such financial liabilities. He is responsible for supporting any relatives who are poor or incapable of earning according to the degree of kinship, while she bears no such burden. Even when a couple separates, the man must continue to pay for the nursing and upbringing of his child, just as he was responsible for the woman's sustenance during their marriage. Thus, the distribution of inheritance is determined by the burden of responsibility, and the man's obligations far exceed the share of wealth he receives. This system takes into account his nature, his capacity to earn, and the need to provide women with complete security and peace of mind so that they may devote themselves to the most sacred of trusts, the guardianship of human life itself, a duty beyond measure, incomparable to any material production or economic contribution to society. Thus, we behold the sublime equilibrium and precise wisdom of the divine order, the law ordained by the All-Wise, the All-Knowing. And here Islam affirms the woman's right to independent ownership. Unto men is a portion of what they earn, and unto women is a portion of what they earn. This was a right denied to women in the Jahiliyyah of old, just as it continues to be undermined in the modern Jahiliyyah that falsely claims to have liberated women. It is the truth unwavering and eternal, the truth that the modern manifestations of Jahiliyyah, though claiming to have granted women rights and respect beyond what any other system has given them, continue to encroach upon. Some of these systems decree that inheritance shall be granted only to the eldest male heir. Others stipulate that a woman must obtain her guardian's permission before entering into any financial contract. Yet others require a wife to seek her husband's consent before making any financial transaction with her own wealth. And this, after all the revolutions and movements undertaken in the name of women's rights, after all the upheavals that have ensued, corrupting the very structure of the woman's role, the institution of the family, and the moral climate of society as a whole. Islam, however, bestowed upon her this right from the very outset without her needing to demand it, without the necessity of revolution, without the agitation of feminist associations, and without the intervention of parliamentary representation. It granted her this right as an integral part of its comprehensive vision, a vision that honours the human being as such, that dignifies both halves of the same soul from which humanity was created, that builds its entire social order upon the foundation of the family, and that safeguards this sacred institution with love, mutual care, and equal guarantees for every individual within it. From this perspective arose the principle of equality between men and women in matters of ownership and earning, an equality established as a fundamental norm. Dr. Abd al-Wahid Wafi, in his book Human Rights, makes a profound observation regarding the status of women in Islam as compared to their status in Western nations. Islam has established equality between men and women before the law and in all civil rights, whether a woman is married or unmarried. Marriage in Islam differs from marriage in most Christian Western nations in that it does not strip a woman of her name, her legal identity, her capacity to enter into contracts, or her right to own property. The Muslim woman, even after marriage, retains her name and the name of her family, preserves all her civil rights, and retains full legal capacity to assume obligations, conduct various transactions, whether in selling, purchasing, mortgaging, gifting, or bequeathing, and to possess wealth independently of others. A married woman in Islam possesses a complete legal personality and maintains her wealth separately from that of her husband. The husband has no right to take anything from her wealth, be it little or much. As God the Most High has said, "And if you wish to replace one wife with another and have given one of them a great treasure, do not take anything from it. Would you take it by way of slander and manifest sin? And how could you take it when you have been intimate with one another and they have taken from you a solemn covenant?" And he also says, "And it is not lawful for you to take anything of what you have given them." If, then, it is forbidden for a husband to reclaim even what he himself had given to his wife, how much more so is he forbidden from taking anything from her own wealth unless she willingly gives it to him out of her own free and uncoerced will. And in this regard God says, "And give the women their dowries as a free gift, but if they of their own accord remit any part of it to you, then consume it in satisfaction and ease. Likewise, a husband has no right to dispose of any part of his wife's wealth unless she explicitly permits him or appoints him as her agent in a particular transaction. Even then she retains the right to revoke his agency and appoint another in his place, if she so desires. This level of equality has not yet been achieved even now by the most advanced legal systems in the most democratic nations of the modern world. In France, until very recently, and even to this day, in some respects, the legal status of women has closely resembled a form of civil bondage. The law has deprived them of legal capacity in many aspects of civil life, as stated in Article 217 of the French Civil Code. A married woman, even when her marriage is based on the principle of the separation of property, may neither donate nor transfer ownership nor mortgage nor acquire property, whether for consideration or as a gift, without the participation of her husband in the contract or his written consent. This provision, despite the modifications and restrictions introduced over time, continues to impose significant legal constraints upon French women to this very day. Further reinforcing this state of subjugation is the practice, enshrined in the laws and customs of Western nations, whereby a woman, upon marriage, forfeits her name and the name of her family. No longer is she known as so-and-so, daughter of so-and-so. Instead, she takes on the name of her husband and his family, being addressed as Madame so-and-so or appending her husband's name to her own, rather than retaining that of her father and her lineage. The loss of a woman's name and her adoption of her husband's name symbolize the erasure of her legal identity and her absorption into the legal personality of her spouse. What is even more astonishing is that many of our own women strive to imitate Western women in this very practice, accepting for themselves this lowly status, forsaking their own names to adopt those of their husbands, or appending their names with those of their husbands and their husbands' families, instead of preserving the names of their own fathers and their own families, as is the practice in Islam. This is the height of blind imitation. And even more perplexing is that those who most ardently advocate for women's rights and gender equality are often the very same women who willingly surrender this fundamental right one that Islam granted them, thereby elevating their status and placing them on equal footing with men. Now we come to the final passage in this section 1 that regulates certain contractual bonds of allegiance that predated the Islamic laws of inheritance. These contracts had previously allowed inheritance to pass to individuals outside of direct kinship, whereas the Islamic legal framework later confined inheritance strictly to blood relations. And for every one of you, we have appointed rightful heirs to what has been left by parents and relatives. And as for those with whom you have entered into a pact, give them their due. Indeed, God is ever a witness over all things. After having established that men shall have a share of what they earn, and women shall have a share of what they earn, and after having detailed the respective shares of male and female heirs in inheritance, the text now declares that God has appointed rightful heirs from among one's kin, those who shall inherit from whatever has passed down from parents and close relatives. Thus, wealth continues to be circulated through inheritance, passing from one generation to the next. Heirs inherit, then accumulate wealth through their own earnings, only for it to pass on to their successors among their kin. This is the natural cycle of wealth in the Islamic system. A continuous process of inheritance, circulation and distribution, bringing about a perpetual reshuffling of ownership and a constant reallocation of wealth among individuals and families over time. Then follows a reference to those contractual arrangements acknowledged by Islamic law, which sometimes allowed inheritance to pass to individuals outside of direct kinship. These were the pacts of allegiance, uqud al-mawalat, of which several types were known in early Islamic society. The first was the Pact of Manumission, whereby a freed slave, upon being granted liberty, became akin to a member of his former master's family, Mawla al-Ittiq. His former master would be responsible for paying his blood money, diyah, if he committed an offence requiring such payment, just as one would for a blood relative, and would inherit from him if he died without leaving any direct male heirs. The second was the Pact of Alliance, which allowed a non-Arab without heirs to enter into a contractual bond with an Arab patron, Mala al-Mawalat, thereby becoming akin to a member of his patron's family, with similar rights and obligations. The third was the Pact of Brotherhood, instituted by the Prophet at the dawn of Islam in Medina, whereby a muhajir could inherit from an Ansari, just as a blood relative would, unless his own family remained outside the fold of faith. The fourth was a customary practice of pre-Islamic Arabia, wherein two men would pledge to one another, saying, "You shall inherit from me, and I shall inherit from you." Islam set out to purify these covenants, especially the third and fourth types, by establishing that inheritance is based solely on kinship alone. However, it did not annul the agreements that had already been made, but rather upheld them, while prohibiting the formation of new ones. And God Most High said, "And to those with whom you have made a covenant, give them their due share." He emphasized this command, bearing witness to the covenant and its execution. Indeed, God is ever a witness over all things, and the Messenger of God, peace and blessings be upon him, declared, "There is no alliance in Islam. Any alliance that existed in the pre-Islamic era is only reinforced by Islam." Narrated by Ahmad and Muslim. Thus did Islam proceed in purifying these covenants, as it did with all matters concerning economic systems, addressing them without retroactive effect. This was its approach with usury. When it was abolished from the moment the decree was revealed, while past transactions were left untouched. People were not commanded to return the interest already taken. Though Islam did not validate usurious contracts made before its prohibition, it did not require the repayment of interest already received. But in this particular case, Islam went even further. It respected these existing covenants while forbidding any new ones to be formed. This was because beyond financial considerations, these covenants carried familial bonds intertwined in a complex web of relationships. Thus, Islam allowed these existing agreements to stand, insisting upon their fulfillment while decisively cutting off any future arrangements before they could generate complications requiring further intervention. In this approach, one perceives both facilitation and depth, an all-encompassing wisdom that embraces every facet of life. Islam was shaping the contours of a new society day by day, erasing the remnants of pre-Islamic Jahiliyyah with every decree and every ordinance. The final subject of this discourse concerns the organization of the family as an institution, establishing order within it, delineating responsibilities, assigning duties, and laying down the necessary procedures to maintain its stability, shielding it from the tempests of passion and discord, and protecting it to the utmost extent possible from forces of disintegration and destruction. Men are the protectors and maintainers of women, by virtue of that which God has favoured some of them over others, and by virtue of what they spend of their wealth. So the righteous women are devoutly obedient, guarding in absence that which God has ordained to be guarded. And as for those women whose rebellion you fear, admonish them, abandon them in their sleeping places, and strike them lightly. Then if they obey you, seek not a way against them, for indeed God is most high supreme. And if you fear a breach between them, then appoint an arbiter from his family and an arbiter from hers. If they both desire reconciliation, God shall bring harmony between them. Indeed, God is all-knowing, all-aware. Before embarking upon the interpretation of these verses and elucidating their psychological and social objectives, it is necessary to present an overview of Islam's perspective on the family as an institution, its method in establishing and preserving it, and its underlying purpose. This overview will be as concise as possible, for a detailed discussion would require an extensive, dedicated study. The one who created man has ingrained within his very nature the principle of pairing, just as he has done with all things in existence. And of everything we have created pairs, so that you may reflect. Then by divine decree he fashioned the two halves of the human soul as counterparts to one another. O mankind, be conscious of your sustainer who created you from a single soul and from it created its mate. And in the union of these two halves, he willed that there should be tranquility of soul, serenity of nerves, peace of spirit, and comfort of body. He willed that marriage should serve as a covering and a protection, a means of preservation and moral safeguarding. And he willed that it should be a fertile ground for the perpetuation of life, ensuring its continuous refinement and advancement within the embrace of a stable, serene, and safeguarded home. And among his signs is that he created for you from yourselves, spouses, that you may find tranquility in them. And he placed between you affection and mercy. They are a garment for you, and you are a garment for them. Your wives are a tilth for you, so approach your tilth as you will and send forth good deeds for yourselves, and be conscious of God. O you who have believed, protect yourselves and your families from a fire whose fuel is men and stones. And those who have believed and whose offspring have followed them in faith, we shall unite them with their descendants, and we shall not deprive them of anything from their deeds. From the equal standing of the two halves of the human soul before God, and from the honour bestowed upon humanity as a whole, there arises the dignity of woman and her equal entitlement to reward and recompense in the sight of God. She enjoys the right to own property, to inherit, and to maintain an independent legal identity, topics that we have already discussed in the preceding pages of this discourse. And from the profound significance of the union between these two halves of the human soul, from the immense responsibility carried by this institution, first in providing its members with tranquility, security, and moral protection, and second in ensuring the continuity and advancement of human society, arises the meticulous and comprehensive legislation governing every aspect of family life. This surah has presented a portion of these regulations, which we have examined in the preceding pages of this section, as a continuation of what we had explored earlier in the fourth section. Surah Al-Baqarah contains another portion, which we studied in the second section. Additional aspects are found in other surahs, most notably Surah An-Nur in the 18th section, Surah Al-Ahzab in the 21st and 22nd sections, and Surahs At-Talaq and At-Tarim in the 28th section. Furthermore, numerous other verses scattered throughout the Qur'an complete this intricate, all-encompassing and precise framework, a framework that constitutes a comprehensive and flawless constitution for the regulation of this fundamental human institution. The sheer abundance, diversity and depth of these rulings bear testimony to the immense significance that the Islamic way of life accords to the family, recognizing it as the cornerstone of human existence and the foundation upon which civilization itself is built. We hope that the reader of these pages still recalls what was previously discussed in this very section concerning the childhood of the human being, its length, and the necessity of an environment that would shelter and protect the child until it is able to earn its sustenance. More importantly, that environment must prepare the child, through education and nurture, for its social function, enabling it to fulfill its share in the advancement of human civilization, leaving the world better than it was found upon arrival. This subject holds particular weight in illuminating the significance of the family as an institution, as well as the perspective of the Islamic framework regarding its functions, its ultimate purpose, and the care it bestows upon safeguarding it from all threats, whether near or far, that might lead to its disintegration. Within these succinct references to Islam's view of the family, its importance, and the extent to which it seeks to provide the guarantees necessary for its survival, stability and tranquility, alongside what we have already mentioned regarding the honor Islam confers upon women, granting them independence of personality, respect, and rights that were not merely bestowed out of favoritism, but rather as part of its grand design to ennoble humanity as a whole and elevate human life. We may now turn to the final passage in this discourse, which we have introduced with these preliminary clarifications. This passage, in its endeavour to regulate the institution of marriage and delineate the organizational roles within it, so as to prevent friction among its members, by referring them all to the judgment of God, rather than to arbitrary whims, emotions, or personalities, establishes that guardianship within this institution belongs to the man. It cites as reasons for this guardianship that God has endowed the man with the necessary qualities and faculties for such a role, and that he bears the financial duty of supporting the institution. Based on this assignment of guardianship, the passage further delineates the responsibilities entailed in upholding the integrity of the family, protecting it from transient impulses, and addressing these impulses should they arise within defined boundaries. Finally, it outlines the external measures to be taken when internal remedies fail, and the spectre of danger looms over the institution, not only threatening the two halves of a single soul, but also endangering the tender fledglings nurtured within this sanctuary, now exposed to ruin and destruction. Let us then examine each of these measures, seeking to understand the necessity and wisdom behind them to the best of our ability. Men are the protectors and maintainers of women by virtue of what God has favored some of them over others, and by virtue of what they spend of their wealth. The family, as we have stated, is the primary institution of human life, primary in the sense that it is the starting point that influences all subsequent stages of existence, and primary in its significance because it is entrusted with the creation and cultivation of the human being, the noblest of all creatures in the Islamic conception of the universe. If lesser institutions, those of finance, industry, commerce, and the like, are not entrusted to any but the most competent candidates, those who have specialized in such fields through theoretical study and practical training, and who, in addition, possess natural aptitudes for leadership and management, then how much more should this principle apply to the family, the institution responsible for shaping the most precious element in existence, the human being? The divine methodology takes this into account, aligning itself with innate nature and the inherent aptitudes of the two halves of the human soul, each being uniquely equipped for the functions assigned to it. It also upholds the principle of justice in the distribution of responsibilities, ensuring that each half of the soul is tasked with duties suited to its intrinsic faculties, duties for which it has been physiologically, psychologically, and intellectually prepared. It is an incontrovertible truth that both man and woman are creations of God, and that God exalted be, he does not seek to wrong any of his creatures. Rather, he prepares each for a particular function, endowing them with the capabilities necessary to excel in that function. God has created human beings as male and female two counterparts, in accordance with the universal principle upon which the cosmos is built. He has assigned to the woman the role of bearing, delivering, nursing, and nurturing the offspring that results from her union with the man. These are weighty and momentous tasks, by no means simple or easy, requiring profound physiological, psychological, and intellectual preparation, deeply embedded in the very fabric of the female being. It is thus only fair that God has entrusted the other half, the man, with the duty of securing the necessities of life, as well as providing protection for the woman, so that she may devote herself fully to her vital task without being burdened with the simultaneous responsibilities of childbearing, nursing, and nurturing, while also laboring, striving, and keeping vigil to secure her own sustenance and that of her child. It is only just, then, that man should be granted qualities in his physical, neurological, intellectual, and psychological makeup that equip him for these responsibilities, just as woman is endowed with attributes that enable her to fulfill her own. And thus it has been ordained, and your sustainer does not wrong anyone. For this reason, woman has been endowed, among other distinguishing traits, with tenderness, compassion, and an instinctive, immediate responsiveness to the needs of the child, without deliberation or prior thought. The profound necessities of human existence, even within an individual, have not been left to the vacillations of conscious reasoning, nor to its slowness. Rather, the response to them has been made involuntary, so that their fulfillment may be immediate, almost as though compelled, yet a compulsion that arises from within, not imposed from without. It is a compulsion that is, in most cases, both delightful and desirable, ensuring that the response is not only swift, but also deeply fulfilling, no matter the hardship or sacrifice involved. This is the handiwork of God, who has perfected all things. These traits are not superficial, they are deeply ingrained in the physiological, neurological, intellectual, and psychological constitution of the woman. Indeed, Leading experts in the field affirm that they are embedded within the very structure of every cell, for they are inherent in the first cell from which the embryo develops, carrying within it all the fundamental characteristics of the human being. Likewise, man has been endowed, among other attributes, with strength, resilience, and a measured deliberate responsiveness, employing reason and thought before action. From the earliest days of human existence, his roles, whether hunting for sustenance, defending his family, or securing provision, have required patience, contemplation, and a general slowness in reaction, ensuring that every step is deliberate and considered. These qualities are as deeply rooted in his nature as the distinctive traits of woman are in hers. These characteristics render him more suited for guardianship, more capable of fulfilling its demands. Furthermore, his financial obligation and extension of the division of responsibilities further substantiates his role as guardian, for providing for the family and managing its resources falls naturally within the scope of his function. These two factors, the physiological and psychological predisposition for guardianship and the financial responsibility assigned to him, are the very reasons highlighted in the divine revelation when affirming man's role as the protector and maintainer of women within the Islamic society. This guardianship is not arbitrary, it is rooted in inherent faculties and preparedness. It is a function of the natural division of roles and duties, grounded in justice, ensuring that each half of the soul is tasked with what it is naturally equipped to perform. His superiority in this regard is not an abstract privilege, but rather a practical necessity rooted in his ability to assume the role, his training in its demands, and his fulfillment of its conditions. No institution can function without leadership, even those of lesser significance and worth. One half of the human soul is inherently suited for this role, prepared for it, equipped with its burdens, while the other half is not. To impose this responsibility upon the latter, in addition to its own essential duties, would be unjust. If, however, the latter were moulded for this role, trained and conditioned for it, its aptitude for its original function, motherhood would be compromised. For that, too, requires its own faculties and preparations, chief among them being emotional responsiveness and immediacy of reaction, not to mention the physiological and neurological predispositions that shape behavior and response. These are grave matters, far too grave to be left to the whims and desires of men, far too perilous to be abandoned to their blind groping in the dark. For whenever such matters have been surrendered to human caprice, whether in the Jahiliyyah of ancient times or in the Jahiliyyah of modernity, humanity itself has been placed in jeopardy, jeopardizing not only its very survival but also those essential human qualities upon which life itself is founded and by which it acquires its distinctive dignity. And perhaps among the signs by which the innate nature of man asserts itself, by which it proclaims its existence, its dominion, and the immutable laws that govern humankind, even when they deny them, reject them, and seek to turn away from them. Perhaps among these signs is the chaos, corruption, and moral decay that have afflicted human life. The decline and collapse, the looming spectre of ruin and annihilation that have invariably followed whenever this fundamental principle has been neglected. Whenever the authority of guardianship within the family has been shaken, its contours blurred, or its natural foundation distorted, the consequences have been dire. And perhaps among these signs is the yearning within a woman's soul for this guardianship to be established upon its natural foundation. Within the family, the sense of loss, deficiency, anxiety, and diminished happiness that afflicts her when she lives with a man who does not fulfill the role of guardian, who lacks the qualities required for it, and who instead leaves the burden upon her shoulders. This is a truth that even those who have strayed into darkness acknowledge, even those who have wandered far from the path of nature. And perhaps among these signs is the condition of children raised in households where the father does not hold the reins of guardianship, whether because he is weak of character, overshadowed and dominated by the mother, or because he is absent either by death or by the lack of a legitimate father. Seldom do such children grow up to be well adjusted. Rarely do they escape some form of deviation in their psychological and emotional makeup, in their practical conduct, or in their moral character. These, then, are but some of the signs by which nature asserts its dominion, by which it testifies to its existence, its governing laws, and its sway over the human race, even when they deny it, reject it, and turn away from it. Yet we cannot delve too deeply into this matter here in this context, nor can we expound at length upon the guardianship of men, its foundations, its justifications, its necessity, and its alignment with the natural order. But it must be said that this guardianship does not in any way obliterate the personality of the woman, whether within the household or within society at large. Nor does it negate her civil status, as we have previously explained. Rather, it is a function, a responsibility within the structure of the family, an essential role in the management, preservation, and protection of this vital institution. The presence of a guardian in any institution does not nullify the presence, personality, or rights of its members, nor of those who contribute to its functioning. Indeed, Islam, in other passages, has outlined the nature of man's guardianship, its attendant obligations of kindness, care, protection, and provision, and the moral responsibilities in his conduct toward his wife and children. And after clarifying the man's duty, his right, and the obligations and burdens of guardianship, comes the description of the believing, righteous woman, her character, her conduct as shaped by faith, and her role within the family. Thus, the righteous women are devoutly obedient, guarding in the unseen that which God has ordained to be guarded. It is a mark of the believing, righteous woman, an inherent trait that stems from her faith and her virtue, that she is devoutly obedient. And obedience, in this sense, is not merely submission, it is a willing, conscious and loving devotion, a harmony of the heart, not a grudging compliance imposed by force, coercion or resistance. Hence, the verse describes them as devoutly obedient rather than simply obedient, for the former conveys an inner disposition, a gentle and serene resonance, one that befits the dwelling of peace and affection, the sanctuary of warmth and protection, wherein the next generation is nurtured, absorbing from its atmosphere its whispers, its shadows, and its rhythms. And it is also a mark of the believing, righteous woman, an inherent trait that stems from her faith and her virtue, that she is a guardian of the sanctity of the sacred bond between herself and her husband in his absence, and all the more so in his presence. She does not allow herself to transgress, whether in a glance or a tone of voice, let alone in matters of honour and chastity beyond what is rightfully his, for he is the other half of the single soul. And what is forbidden is not for her to determine, nor for him. Rather, it is God alone who sets these limits, for they guard in the unseen that which God has ordained to be guarded. Thus, it is not merely a question of whether the husband is pleased or displeased with what his wife permits of herself, whether in his absence or in his presence, nor of the dictates of society, should society deviate from the path of God. There is but one standard, one decree regarding this guardianship. She must safeguard herself as God has ordained. And the Quranic expression does not command this in the form of an instruction. Rather, it affirms it as an intrinsic quality, deeper and more emphatic than a mere command. It states that this guardianship, as God has ordained, is an inherent trait of the righteous women, a natural extension of their virtue. And so, all the excuses of those who waver, of Muslim men and women who succumb to the pressures of a wayward society, collapse before this divine decree. Here, the boundaries of what the righteous women safeguard as God has ordained stand firm, alongside their willing, loving devotion. But as for those who are not righteous, they are the rebellious ones, the Nashizat. And Nushuz, rebellion, evokes an image drawn from the physical world, that of something rising, protruding above the earth. It is a striking metaphor for a psychological state for the rebellious woman who asserts herself in defiance and insubordination. The Islamic path does not wait for rebellion to manifest in full force, for defiance to be declared, for the authority of guardianship to be shattered, and for the household to split into opposing camps. For when matters reach such a stage, remedies are of little use. Instead, the approach is preemptive, addressing the first signs of rebellion before they escalate for the natural course of unchecked rebellion is the corruption of this vital institution, the loss of tranquility and security, and the destruction of the nurturing environment that shapes the next generation. Beyond that, it leads to breakdown, collapse, and ruin, leaving children abandoned to the winds of destruction, subjected to influences that sow the seeds of psychological, emotional, and even physical ailments, leading ultimately to deviance. The matter then is of the utmost gravity. It demands early intervention at the first signs of rebellion through a measured and gradual approach. And in order to safeguard the institution from corruption or ruin, the one entrusted with its care has been permitted to exercise a form of corrective discipline in certain cases, not out of vengeance, nor to humiliate or torment, but to mend and restore harmony at the earliest stage of discord. And as for those women whose rebellion you fear, admonish them, then leave them alone in their beds, then strike them. But if they return to obedience, seek no way against them. Indeed, God is most high, supreme, and recalling all that has been previously explained, the dignity with which God has honoured both man and woman, the rights of women as human beings, their full legal and civil status, their autonomy in choosing a spouse, their authority over their own affairs and wealth, alongside the necessity of guardianship and the paramount importance of the family, we can then clearly understand, so long as hearts are not veiled by caprice nor minds clouded by arrogance, why such corrective measures were legislated and the manner in which they are to be applied. They were prescribed as a preventive measure at the mere fear of rebellion, not to deepen discord, nor to fill hearts with resentment and humiliation, but to restore harmony and righteousness before the rift widens. It is never a battle between man and woman, where these measures serve to break the woman's will and drag her back in chains like a subjugated beast. Indeed, this is certainly not Islam. Rather, it is a set of environmental traditions that emerged in certain eras, alongside the general degradation of humanity itself, not merely the abasement of one particular segment of it. But when it is Islam, the matter takes on a wholly different form and appearance, a different purpose and meaning altogether. And those wives whose ill will you have reason to fear, admonish them. This is the first step, admonition. And this is the foremost duty of the guardian, the head of the household, a disciplinary effort required of him in every situation. O you who have attained to faith, ward off from yourselves and those who are close to you a fire whose fuel is human beings and stones. Yet in this particular case, such admonition takes a specific direction toward a precise aim, to address the symptoms of discord before they fester and manifest into open defiance. However, words of counsel may sometimes prove ineffective, for there may be an overwhelming passion or an unbridled impulse, or an arrogance born of beauty, wealth, lineage, or any other form of prestige that blinds a wife to the fact that she is a partner in an institution, not a rival in a contest, or a competitor in a game of vanity. At this juncture, the second measure comes into play, a psychological assertion of self-discipline by the man over the very things through which the woman asserts her dominance. Beauty, allure, or any other attribute she employs to elevate herself above him, or above the role of a partner in an institution in which he has been entrusted with authority, and leave them alone in their sleeping places. And the sleeping place is the very domain of seduction and attraction, where a defiant woman, puffed up with pride, wields her greatest influence. If the man can master his own impulses in the face of such allure, then he has disarmed the rebellious wife of her most potent weapon. More often than not, this steadfastness on his part, this display of self-restraint and strength of character at its most critical test, leads her to reconsider, to soften, to relent. Yet even in this measure, there is a certain decorum to be observed, a decorum that dictates that such estrangement should remain confined to the privacy of the couple's intimate space. It should not be displayed before children, lest it sow in their hearts the seeds of bitterness and corruption. Nor should it be exhibited before outsiders, lest it humiliate the wife or provoke her sense of dignity, thereby deepening her defiance. The purpose is to mend the discord, not to degrade the woman or to corrupt the household, and both these objectives are evidently at the heart of this directive. But what if this step too fails? Should the entire institution then crumble? There remains one final measure, harsher perhaps, yet still far less severe than allowing the family unit to collapse under the weight of prolonged discord, and strike them. Yet, if all the preceding meanings are borne in mind, if the purpose of these measures is understood in their true essence, then it becomes clear that this striking is not meant as an act of vengeance or cruelty. It is not intended as a means of humiliation or degradation, nor is it to be employed as a tool of coercion, forcing a woman to remain in a marriage against her will. Rather, it is a corrective measure, carried out with the concern of a guardian and the tenderness of a teacher, much like the discipline a father imparts to his child or a mentor to his student. And it is well understood beyond any need for elaboration that these measures have no place in a marriage where harmony prevails between the two partners in this most sacred of institutions. They are meant solely as remedies for a disruption, a deviation from the natural order. Such steps are not invoked unless there exists a genuine moral lapse, one that must be addressed through these prescribed means. For when admonition proves fruitless and estrangement in the marital bed fails to bring about change, then the deviation in question must be of a different nature, one that is not swayed by gentler methods, but may yet respond to this final recourse. And indeed, psychological observations and real-life experiences affirm that certain dispositions, certain behavioral inclinations may best be addressed through this measure. For in some cases, this is the only means by which a particular psychological imbalance can be rectified. Moreover, apart from such rare psychological conditions which, though named and categorized by psychoanalysts, remain subject to debate, for psychology itself has yet to attain the certitude of exact science. There may also exist among women those who, by their very nature, do not perceive the strength of the man they love and accept as their guardian unless he asserts his authority in a tangible way. Such women, though not the norm, do indeed exist, and it is for this category that this final step may sometimes be necessary to restore balance, to preserve the sanctity of the institution, ensuring peace and stability within it. Yet in the end it is he who has ordained these measures, he who has created, and thus knows best the nature of his creation. And any argument that seeks to challenge the wisdom of the all-knowing, the all-aware, is but a futile wrangling. Any rebellion against the decree of the Creator, any refusal to submit to his will, leads ultimately to estrangement from the very essence of faith itself. And he exalted be, he has laid down these directives within a context, within specific conditions that define their nature, their intent, and their ultimate purpose, so that the true path of God is not mistaken for the misguided notions of the ignorant, so that his law is not perverted into a justification for tyranny where a man becomes a ruthless oppressor in the name of religion, and a woman is reduced to servitude under the guise of faith. Nor should his guidance be distorted by those who, in their misunderstanding, seek to erase the distinctions he has set, where men abandon their roles and women assume theirs, or where both are reduced to a formless, indistinct existence in the name of progress. For all such distortions are readily distinguishable from the clear and luminous way of Islam, which stands apart in its wisdom and purpose. Thus these measures have been permitted solely as remedies for discord before it takes root and becomes irreparable. And they have been accompanied by the gravest of warnings against their misuse. Indeed, even as they were sanctioned, caution was immediately issued against any excess in their application. And the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, personally demonstrated through his own household and his explicit teachings the balance that must be maintained. It is recorded in the Sunan and the Musnad from Muawiyah ibn Haydar al-Kushari that he asked, "O Messenger of God, what is the right of a wife upon her husband?" And the Prophet replied, "That you feed her when you eat, clothe her when you clothe yourself, that you do not strike her in the face, nor disgrace her, nor abandon her except within the home." And it is related by Abu Dawud, Al-Nasai and Ibn Majah that the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, said, "Do not strike the female servants of God." Yet Umar, may God be pleased with him, later came to the Prophet and said, "The women have become emboldened against their husbands." So the Prophet allowed it. But then, many women came to the family of the Prophet complaining of their husbands. And seeing this, the Prophet declared, "Many women have come to the household of Muhammad complaining of their husbands. Those men are not the best among you." And he also said, "Let none of you strike his wife as he would strike a slave, then seek to embrace her at day's end. And the best of you are those who are best to their families, and I am the best of you to my family." Such are the teachings, and such were the struggles between the vestiges of Jahiliyyah and the light of divine guidance. In this, as in all other aspects of life, until the new order of Islam took root, and its principles became deeply embedded in the conscience of the believers. In any case, these measures have been given a limit, beyond which they must not go once the intended purpose has been achieved at a particular stage of their application. They are not to extend beyond it. And if they obey you, then do not seek a way against them. Thus, when the objective is realized, the means must come to a halt. This signifies that the goal, namely obedience, is the true intent, and it is an obedience born of willingness, not one coerced by force. For such coerced submission is not the kind of obedience upon which the family institution, the very foundation of society, can be built. This verse further implies that to persist in these measures after obedience has been attained would be an act of oppression, an abuse of power, and an overstepping of bounds. Do not seek a way against them. And then, this prohibition is followed by a reminder of the Most High, the Most Great, so that hearts may humble themselves, heads may bow in reverence, and any trace of arrogance or tyranny, if it lingers in some souls, may dissolve in the manner of the Qur'an, which alternates between persuasion and warning. Indeed, God is ever Most High, Most Great. This applies when defiance has not yet manifested openly, but when its early signs are merely suspected. However, if rebellion has become manifest, then those prior measures are of no benefit, they hold no value, nor do they bear fruit. At that stage they become nothing more than a conflict, a battle between two adversaries, each striving to crush the other's resolve. But this is not the intent, nor is it the desired outcome. Likewise, if it is foreseen that the application of those measures will not be effective, but will instead widen the rift, entrench rebellion further, and sever the remaining delicate threads that still bind the relationship, or if those measures have already been applied and have yielded no result, then in all such cases, the wise Islamic approach prescribes a final course of action to save this noble institution from collapse before it is abandoned entirely to its ruin. And if you fear a breach between them, then appoint an arbitrator from his people and an arbitrator from her people. If they both desire reconciliation, God will bring about harmony between them. Verily, God is all-knowing, all-aware. Thus, the Islamic approach does not advocate surrender to the first signs of discord and resentment, nor does it hasten to sever the bond of marriage and destroy the family institution, bringing ruin upon those within it, both the elders and the young, who bear no fault and have no power over their fate. Indeed, the family institution is held in great esteem in Islam, equal to the gravity of its role in shaping society, in providing it with new generations, essential for its growth, advancement, and continuity. Islam resorts to this final measure when discord is feared before discord fully takes hold. It appoints an arbitrator from her family whom she trusts, and an arbitrator from his family whom he trusts. These two come together in calm deliberation, away from the emotional turbulence, the accumulated grievances, and the domestic circumstances that have clouded the clarity of the marital bond. They are free from these influences, which often poison the atmosphere of life, complicate matters, and because of their proximity to the hearts of the spouses, seem in their eyes to overshadow all the good that remains. They are invested in the honour of both families, compassionate toward the young children, devoid of any desire to see one party triumph over the other, as may be the case with the spouses themselves in times of strife, but instead they are eager for the well-being of both, the welfare of their children, and the preservation of their threatened institution. At the same time, they are entrusted with the secrets of the couple, for they come from their own kin. There is no fear that they will expose these secrets, for they have no interest in doing so. Rather, their interest lies in concealing and protecting them. The two arbitrators convene with the sincere intent of reconciliation. And if, within the hearts of the spouses, there exists a genuine desire for harmony, if it is only the veils of anger that obscure this desire, then, with the aid of the strong will of the arbitrators, God grants them reconciliation and understanding. If they both desire reconciliation, God will bring about harmony between them. They seek peace, and God responds to their efforts and grants them success. Such is the connection between human intentions, human striving, and the divine will and decree. It is God's decree that determines what unfolds in the lives of people. Yet people retain the ability to direct themselves, to make an effort, and then, by God's will, what is destined shall come to pass, in accordance with his knowledge of hidden truths and his perfect awareness of what is truly beneficial. Indeed, God is all-knowing, all-aware. Thus, in this lesson, we perceive the gravity and solemnity with which Islam regards the role of woman, the relationship between the sexes, the institution of family, and the social bonds that stem from it. We witness the profound concern of the Islamic approach in organizing this crucial aspect of human life. And we observe the immense effort exerted by this magnificent path as it lifts the Muslim community whom it had drawn forth from the abyss of Jahiliyyah onto the ascending path, guiding it toward the lofty summit, under the light of God's guidance, for there is no guidance but his. Worship God and do not associate anything with him. And be kind to parents, to relatives, to orphans, to the needy, to the near neighbour, to the distant neighbour, to the companion at your side, to the traveller, and to those your right hands possess. Verily God does not love those who are arrogant and boastful, those who are miserly and enjoin others to be miserly, and who conceal what God has given them of his bounty. And we have prepared for the disbelievers a humiliating punishment. And those who spend their wealth to be seen by people and do not believe in God, nor in the last day, whoever has Satan as his companion, what an evil companion he is. And what would it have harmed them if they had believed in God and the last day, and spent from what God had provided them? And God is ever knowing of them. Indeed, God does not wrong even the weight of a speck of dust, and if there is a good deed, he multiplies it and grants from himself a great reward. So how will it be when we bring forth from every nation a witness, and we bring you, O Muhammad, as a witness over these? On that day, those who disbelieved and disobeyed the messenger will wish that the earth were levelled over them, and they will not be able to conceal anything from God. O you who have believed, do not approach prayer while you are intoxicated until you know what you are saying, nor in a state of impurity, except when travelling until you have washed yourselves. And if you are ill or on a journey, or one of you comes from relieving himself, or you have touched women and do not find water, then seek clean earth and wipe over your faces and hands with it. Indeed, God is ever pardoning, ever forgiving. There is more than one connection linking the opening of this lesson with the central theme of the surah as a whole, with its fundamental subjects on the one hand, and with the topics of the preceding lesson in this section on the other. This lesson marks the beginning of a new phase in the organization of the Muslim society, cleansing it from the remnants of Jahiliyyah, solidifying the new Islamic features, and warning against the people of the book, particularly the Jews of Medina, who were steeped in wickedness and treachery. It exposes the poison they sought to inject into the Muslim community and the relentless efforts they exerted to hinder its growth and unity, especially in the realms of morality and social solidarity, two fundamental pillars of strength in this nascent society. And because this lesson embarks upon a new phase, it begins with the foundational principle upon which the Muslim society is built, the principle of pure monotheism. From this principle, all aspects of life emanate, and from it emerges the framework that governs existence in every sphere and in every direction. Preceding this lesson were various stages in the structuring of family life and social order. The previous discourse was concerned with the family, its organization, the means of preserving it, and the bonds that strengthen its foundation. Now, this lesson moves on to address broader human relationships within the Muslim community, relationships that extend beyond the confines of the family, yet remain closely connected to it. They are connected through the mention of parents, and they expand outward, beyond the parent-child relationship, to encompass other ties that stem from the affectionate and wholesome emotions nurtured within the loving household. These emotions overflow into the broader human sphere, where individuals first learn the values of kindness and compassion within the gentle embrace of their families. From there, these values extend outward, guiding one's relations with the larger human family after their seeds have been sown in the intimate soil of one's own kin. And because this lesson contains directives on caring for both the immediate family, the household, and the extended family, humanity at large, while establishing values and standards for both the generous and the miserly, it opens with the fundamental principle from which all values and standards arise. This principle is the same source from which the entire way of life in the Muslim community originates. The principle of monotheism, binding every action, every endeavor, every impulse, and every emotion to the essence of worshipping God. Worship, in its most comprehensive sense, is the ultimate purpose of all human activity, both in the conscience of the believer and in his outward life. Because of this emphasis on the worship of God alone in its all-encompassing scope, the second section of this lesson clarifies certain rulings concerning prayer and purification. It also takes a step toward the eventual prohibition of intoxicants, though they had not yet been declared unlawful, considering this step as part of the broader Islamic educational program that steadily shaped the emerging community. This prohibition was intricately linked to worship, prayer, and monotheism itself rings in a continuous chain, connected with one another, with the previous lesson, and with the central theme of the surah as well. And worship God, and do not associate anything with him. And be kind to parents, relatives, orphans, the needy, the near neighbour, the distant neighbour, the companion at your side, the traveller, and those whom your right hands possess. Verily, God does not love those who are arrogant and boastful, those who are miserly and enjoin others to be miserly, and who conceal what God has given them of his bounty. And we have prepared for the disbelievers a humiliating punishment. And those who spend their wealth to be seen by people and do not believe in God nor in the last day, whoever has Satan as his companion, what an evil companion he is. And what would it have harmed them if they had believed in God and the last day, and spent from what God had provided them, and God is ever knowing of them? Indeed, God does not wrong even the weight of a speck of dust, and if there is a good deed, he multiplies it and grants from himself a great reward. So how will it be when we bring forth from every nation a witness, and we bring you, O Muhammad, as a witness over these? On that day, those who disbelieved and disobeyed the messenger will wish that the earth were levelled over them, and they will not be able to conceal anything from God. This passage begins with the command to worship God alone, and the prohibition of associating anything with him. It begins with a conjunction linking this command and prohibition with the preceding directives concerning the structuring of the family at the end of the previous lesson. This linkage between the two subjects underscores the comprehensive and integrated unity of this religion. Islam is not merely a creed confined to the inner conscience, nor is it solely a set of rituals and acts of worship, nor is it merely a worldly system detached from faith and spiritual devotion. Rather, it is a holistic framework encompassing all aspects of human activity, binding them together and anchoring them firmly to the fundamental principle, the absolute oneness of God. From him alone is guidance sought, and from him alone is legislation derived in all human affairs. He is the only one to be worshipped, and he is the sole authority from whom all directives and rulings originate. In Islam and in the true religion of God, there is no separation between these aspects. Following the command to uphold monotheism and the prohibition of polytheism, comes the directive to show kindness to those bound by family ties and to various groups within the human community. This is followed by condemnation of miserliness, arrogance, and the act of encouraging others to be miserly, as well as the concealment of God's bounties, whether they be material wealth, knowledge, or religious guidance. The passage warns against following Satan and makes reference to the torment of the hereafter, with its disgrace and exposure of hidden truths. All of this is linked to the principle of monotheism, emphasizing that those who worship God and associate nothing with Him must derive their moral and social values from a single unified source. This source is indivisible, just as God's divinity and the worship owed to Him are indivisible. And worship God and do not associate anything with Him. And be kind to parents, relatives, orphans, and the needy, and to the near neighbour, the distant neighbour, the companion at your side, the traveller, and those whom your right hands possess. All legislation and guidance within God's framework arise from a single origin and rest upon a singular foundation. They are all derived from belief in God and anchored in the absolute monotheism that defines this faith. Because of this, every aspect is interconnected, every component is harmonious, and it becomes difficult to isolate one part from another. To study any single aspect without referring back to its broader foundation results in an incomplete understanding. Likewise, to implement some aspects while neglecting others fails to fulfill the essence of Islam and falls short of realizing the comprehensive fruits of the Islamic way of life. From belief in God arise all fundamental conceptions concerning cosmic, biological, and human relationships. These conceptions serve as the foundation for social, economic, political, ethical, and global systems. They shape human interactions in all areas of life, influence individual conscience and societal reality, and transform all dealings into acts of worship through adherence to God's guidance and consciousness of His presence. At the same time, acts of worship serve as the foundation for human interactions through their role in purifying the heart and refining conduct. Ultimately, this renders life into a cohesive whole, emanating from the divine framework, drawing exclusively from it, and returning both in this world and the hereafter to God alone. This fundamental characteristic of Islamic belief, the Islamic framework, and the true religion of God is manifest in the way the command to show kindness to parents, relatives, and other groups is introduced by the command to worship God and uphold His oneness. It is further emphasized by the way familial ties and broader human relations are bound together under the banner of monotheism. The same monotheism that was placed as the bridge between the charter of the immediate family at the end of the previous lesson and the charter of broader human relations in this lesson, connecting all elements through a singular bond and uniting them under a single source of guidance and legislation. And worship God and do not associate anything with Him. The first command is to worship God, and the second is the prohibition of worshipping anyone alongside Him besides Him. A categorical, all-encompassing prohibition against all forms of worship directed toward any being known to humanity, and do not associate anything with Him. Anything, whatever it may be, whether material, animal, human, angelic, or demonic, for all of these fall within the scope of the word thing when expressed in this absolute manner. Then follows the command to show kindness to parents specifically and to relatives generally. Most directives emphasize the duty of offspring toward their parents, though they do not neglect the guidance parents owe to their children. For God has always been more merciful to the young than their fathers and mothers in all circumstances, and the young in particular are in greater need of being directed toward kindness to their parents, to that generation which is receding and withdrawing. For children by their very nature tend to turn their entire being, their emotions, their concerns, toward the generation that will succeed them, not the one that preceded them. And while they are propelled forward in the current of life, heedless of looking back, these divine exhortations reach them from the most compassionate, the most merciful, who does not abandon parent or child, who does not forget offspring or forebears, and who teaches His servants to show mercy to one another, even when they are children or parents. Likewise, one notices in this verse and in many others that the command to kindness begins with those closest in kinship, whether immediate or extended, and from there expands outward to encompass all who are in need within the broader human family. This approach aligns first and foremost with the natural disposition of man and harmonizes with it. For the sentiments of compassion and the sense of shared responsibility are first nurtured within the home, within the small family unit. Rarely do they arise in a soul that has not tasted the sweetness of such feelings or experienced their warmth in its earliest refuge. Moreover, human nature inclines toward beginning with those nearest by instinct and inclination, and there is no harm in that, provided it is always directed toward ever-expanding circles of care, starting from this focal point. Furthermore, this approach aligns with the Islamic system of social organization, wherein responsibility for care begins within the family and then extends outward into the community. This prevents the mechanisms of social welfare from being concentrated solely in the hands of vast governmental institutions, except in cases where smaller, more direct units are unable to fulfill their role. For local, close-knit structures are better equipped to provide assistance in a timely and efficient manner with ease, warmth and mutual affection, thereby rendering human life more dignified and befitting the children of Adam. Here, the command begins with kindness to parents, then expands to include relatives, and from them to orphans and the destitute, even though these may be physically more distant than a neighbour. This is because they are in greater need and more deserving of care. Then comes mention of the neighbour who shares a bond of kinship, followed by the stranger who is merely a neighbour, both of whom take precedence over a companion or associate. For a neighbour's proximity is constant, whereas a companion's presence is intermittent. Thereafter, the directive extends to the companion in travel, interpreted as meaning either a companion in daily life or a fellow traveller on a journey, then the wayfarer, the one stranded away from home and severed from his means. Lastly, it includes those who, due to circumstances, have come under the ownership of others, yet remain bound by the universal bond of humanity that unites all the children of Adam. This command to kindness is immediately followed by a condemnation of arrogance, vanity, miserliness, and the encouragement of miserliness, as well as the concealment of God's blessings and favours, and the ostentatious display of wealth. The root cause of these vices is then unveiled: a lack of faith in God and the last day, and an alliance with Satan and his companionship. Surely God does not love those who are arrogant and boastful, those who hoard their wealth and enjoin others to do the same, and who conceal what God has bestowed upon them of his bounty. And we have prepared for the disbelievers a humiliating punishment, and those who spend their wealth to be seen by men, but do not believe in God or the last day, whoever takes Satan as an intimate companion, what an evil companion he has taken. Thus, once again, the essential feature of the Islamic way becomes evident: the inseparable connection between all aspects of human conduct, all inner motives of the heart, and all social relationships with the fundamental principle of faith. To worship God alone, to submit to him exclusively, leads inevitably to kindness toward fellow beings, seeking solely his countenance and pleasure, aspiring to his reward in the hereafter, and acting with humility, gentleness, and the awareness that man spends only from what God has provided him. For man neither creates his own sustenance nor attains anything except by God's grace. Conversely, disbelief in God and the last day is accompanied by arrogance, vanity, miserliness, and the promotion of miserliness. It leads to concealing God's bounty so that its effects do not manifest in generosity or acts of kindness, or else to spending ostentatiously, parading one's wealth in pursuit of worldly prestige, for there is no belief in any recompense beyond the fleeting admiration of men. Thus, morality is defined faith-based morality and the morality of disbelief. The motivation for noble deeds and virtuous character stems from faith in God and the last day, from the yearning for his pleasure and the hope of reward in the hereafter. This is a lofty aspiration that does not seek recompense from men, nor does it derive its impulse from human convention. But when faith in God, whose pleasure is sought, is absent, and when no belief in a day of judgment remains, then the motive for action shifts to the pursuit of worldly values, shaped by the ever-changing norms of society. And these norms have no fixed foundation, not even within the same generation or the same land, let alone across all times and places. Thus, human behavior becomes erratic, swayed by the whims and shifting values of mankind. And along with it come those ignoble traits, arrogance, vanity, miserliness, and ostentation, where deeds are performed not out of sincerity, but for the fleeting approval of men. The Quranic expression states that God does not love such people. And God, exalted be He, is not subject to human emotions of love and hate. Rather, the phrase conveys the inevitable consequence of such traits in human experience: rejection, disgrace, and severe retribution. And we have prepared for the disbelievers a humiliating punishment. For humiliation is the fitting recompense for arrogance and vanity. Yet the Quranic expression does more than convey meaning, it casts its own light, stirring aversion in the soul toward these vile attributes and actions, evoking disgust and contempt. And this revulsion deepens when the verse adds that Satan is their intimate companion. And whoever takes Satan as an intimate companion, what an evil companion he has taken. It is reported that these verses were revealed concerning a group of Jews in Medina. Their characteristics indeed align with those of the Jews, just as they align with those of the hypocrites, both of whom coexisted within the Muslim community at that time. Perhaps the mention of their concealing what God had granted them of His bounty alludes as well to their suppression of the truth they recognized in their own scriptures regarding this faith and its noble messenger. Yet the text remains general, and the context is devoted to the subject of generosity in wealth and conduct. Thus, it is most fitting that we leave its meaning broad, for that is closest to the intent of the passage. And when He has laid bare the depravity of their souls and the corruption of their deeds, when He has unveiled the roots of their transgression in their denial of God and the last day, in their companionship with Satan and their submission to his ways, when He has made known the humiliating torment that awaits them as a recompense for their wickedness, then He asks, in a tone of wonder and reproach, and what would it have cost them had they but believed in God and the last day, and spent out of that which God had provided for them? For God has full knowledge of them. Verily God does not wrong even the weight of a dust mote, and if there be a good deed, He multiplies it and grants from His own presence a mighty reward. Indeed, what would it have cost them? What do they fear in believing in God and the last day, and in spending from the sustenance that God Himself has granted them? For God is all-knowing of what they give and of the motives that dwell within their hearts. And He does not wrong anyone, not even to the weight of a speck of dust. Thus they need not fear that their faith and charity will go unnoticed, nor that their reward will be diminished. Nay, rather there is grace and abundance. He multiplies good deeds and adds to them out of His boundless bounty beyond measure. The path of faith is, in every case and under every circumstance, the surest and most rewarding indeed. Even by the reckoning of material profit and loss, faith proves to be the safest and most gainful course. And what would it have cost them had they but believed in God and the last day, and spent out of that which God had provided for them? They were not giving away something they had created by their own power. Rather, they were but sharing of the sustenance that God had bestowed upon them. And yet for this He multiplies their good deeds and grants them even more from His grace. They give only of what He has already given them. What generosity is this? What an abundance of grace! What a transaction indeed, one that none but the foolish and the utterly lost would turn away from. And then, after the exhortations and prohibitions, the urgings and the encouragements, the discourse culminates in a scene from the Day of Judgment, one that vividly portrays their condition, drawing out the emotions and the stirrings of the soul as if they were being enacted before our very eyes, in the manner so characteristic of the Qur'an when it speaks of the hereafter. How then, when we bring forward from every community a witness, and bring you, O Prophet, as a witness over these? On that day, those who disbelieved and disobeyed the messenger will wish that the earth might swallow them, and they will not be able to conceal anything from God. The scene is introduced with the reminder that God does not wrong even the weight of a dust mote, thus establishing the absolute justice of the divine judgment, wherein no balance shall be tilted by even the slightest degree. And He multiplies good deeds and grants beyond them a mighty reward, thus manifesting His mercy upon those who are deserving of it, and his boundless grace upon those who sought his bounty through faith and righteous action. But as for these who neither brought forth faith nor performed good works, these who presented nothing but denial and evil deeds, what shall be their state upon that day? How shall it be for them when we bring forth from every nation a witness its prophet, who shall testify concerning it, and when we bring you forth, O prophet, as a witness over these? And at that moment the scene stands before us in stark clarity, the vast expanse of the gathering place, every nation assembled, and over every nation a witness bearing testimony to its deeds. And there they stand, those who disbelieved, those who strutted in arrogance, those who hoarded wealth and withheld it from others, those who concealed God's bounty and gave in charity only for the eyes of men, without seeking the pleasure of God. We can almost see them as they stand exposed in that great arena, and the messenger, peace and blessings be upon him, is called forth to bear witness against them. There they stand, with all that they once concealed, and all that they openly declared, with all their denials and their rejections, with all their pride and their boastfulness, with all their miserliness and their selfishness, with all their hypocrisy and their pretensions. There they stand before the very Creator whom they denied, before the Sustainer whose bounty they withheld and refused to share, before the day of judgment which they refused to believe in, before the very messenger whom they disobeyed. And what then? It is disgrace and humiliation, shame and remorse accompanied by an admission of guilt, for on that day denial shall be of no avail. Yet the Quranic discourse does not describe all of this explicitly. Rather, it paints a psychological portrait, one that conveys all these meanings and emotions through subtle and profound imagery. The shadows of disgrace and humiliation, of shame and regret, are cast all around them. On that day, those who disbelieved and disobeyed the messenger will wish that the earth might swallow them, and they will not be able to conceal anything from God. And through these vivid strokes we feel deep within us the weight of these meanings, the intensity of these emotions moving within those souls alive, powerful, and piercing more deeply than any description or analysis could ever convey. Such is the Quranic method in depicting the scenes of the hereafter and in all its portrayals through imagery. The discourse had begun with the command to worship God and the prohibition of associating anything with him. And prayer is the most intimate of acts of worship, the closest of all devotional rites to the essence of faith. Thus, in the following verse, some of its ordinances are set forth, along with the rulings on purification that serve as its prelude. O you who have attained to faith, do not approach prayer while you are in a state of intoxication until you know what you are saying, nor in a state of impurity, unless you are merely passing through, until you have purified yourselves. And if you are ill, or on a journey, or if one of you has relieved himself, or if you have had intimate relations with women and find no water, then take clean soil and wipe your faces and your hands therewith. Verily God is ever forgiving, most merciful. This command is but a link in the chain of divine instruction, part of the spiritual and moral training that Islam imparted to the nascent Muslim community whom it had gathered from the depths of Jahiliyyah, from the very foot of the mountain of pre-Islamic barbarism. For intoxicants were deeply entrenched in the customs of that society, one of its most pervasive traditions, one of its defining features. Indeed, intoxicants have always been a hallmark of every age of Jahiliyyah, past and present alike. They were rampant in the Roman civilization at the height of its pagan decadence, as they were in the Persian Empire. And in our own age, they remain a defining vice of the modern Western world, both in Europe and America, in the midst of its materialist decline. The same is true of the primitive societies of Africa, which have inherited the habits of the earliest ages of Jahiliyyah. In Sweden, one of the most advanced nations of modern Jahiliyyah, every household in the first half of the last century would distill its own liquor. The average per capita consumption was nearly 20 litres. When the government became aware of the dangers of this situation and its spread of addiction, it moved to monopolize alcohol production, restrict individual consumption, and prohibit drinking in public establishments. Yet, in recent years, these restrictions have been relaxed. Alcohol is now permitted in restaurants provided it is consumed with food, and certain public venues are allowed to serve it until midnight, after which only wine and beer may be consumed. Meanwhile, teenage alcoholism continues to rise. As for America, the government once attempted to eradicate the phenomenon altogether, enacting prohibition in 1919, a law mockingly referred to as the Great Drying Up, for it sought to drain the land of liquor. This law remained in effect for 14 years, during which the government spent over $60 million on anti-alcohol campaigns, publishing literature amounting to 10 billion pages. Yet after all that, after imprisoning over 300,000 people and imposing fines exceeding $16 million, it was ultimately forced to repeal the law in 1933. But Islam eradicated this deeply ingrained vice in its society with nothing more than a handful of Quranic verses. Such is the difference between God's guidance and the methods of Jahiliyyah past and present alike. And in order to comprehend the deep penetration of this phenomenon into pre-Islamic society, we must turn back to the poetry of that era, where we find that wine was not merely an incidental motif, but rather an essential element of the literary fabric, just as it was a fundamental component of life itself. The trade in wine became so widespread that the very word commerce became synonymous with the selling of wine. Labid says, "I spent the night in its company, the end of a trader's pursuit, arriving when it was raised high and its wine held honour." And Amr ibn Kamiyah says, "When I let the silken robes trail behind me, drawing near to the merchants and shaking off my weariness." The descriptions of drinking assemblies and the boasting that accompanied them crowd the verses of pre-Islamic poetry, leaving a distinct imprint upon it. Imru al-Qais says, "And I awoke, bidding farewell to youth, though I still seek 4 joys from life. One of them, my call to my companions, take your time, savouring the wine-filled goblets. Another, the galloping of horses, lances striking as they charge, surprising a herd that fears no harm." And Tarafa ibn al-Abd says, "Were it not for 3 things that are life's delight, by your existence I would care not when my days end. One of them, my outpacing the reproaches with a draught of deep red wine, which, when mixed with water, froths and foams. I have ever delighted in drinking wine, in my lavish giving, my generosity unbound, until my tribe cast me aside, abandoned me like a worn-out camel." And Al-Asha says, "Indeed, I drank the aged wine, as you well know, both in times of rest and in times of journeying. I drank in the countryside until they said, 'He has tarried too long, tamed by indulgence.'" And Al-Munakkal al-Yashkuri says, "I drank the wine from goblets small and large, and when I was drunk, I was lord of palaces and wealth. Yet when I sobered, I was but the keeper of sheep and camels." And beyond these lines, there exists much more in the poetry of the era. The chronicles of the events that accompanied the gradual prohibition of wine in the Muslim society, and the men who were at the heart of these events, among them Umar, Ali, Hamza, and Abd al-Rahman ibn Auf, reveal the depth to which this phenomenon was embedded in pre-Islamic Arabia. Their very stories suffice in place of long and detailed descriptions. Umar, may God be pleased with him, recounts his own tale in one narration. "I was a man addicted to wine in the time of Jahiliyyah, so I said to myself, 'Let me go to such and such a wine cellar and drink.' And even after embracing Islam, Umar continued drinking until the verse was revealed. They ask you about wine and gambling. Say, 'In them there is great sin and some benefit for people, but their sin is greater than their benefit.'" Upon hearing this, he prayed, "O God, grant us a decisive clarification regarding wine." Yet the practice persisted. Then was revealed the verse, "O you who have believed, do not approach prayer while intoxicated until you know what you are saying." And again Umar pleaded, "O God, grant us a decisive clarification regarding wine." And then came the unequivocal prohibition. Indeed, wine, gambling, idols, and divining arrows are but defilement from the handiwork of Satan, so avoid them that you may prosper. Satan only desires to sow enmity and hatred among you through wine and gambling, and to avert you from the remembrance of God and from prayer. So will you not desist? And upon hearing this, Umar declared, "We desist! We desist!" And thus it ended. Regarding the revelation of the verse, "O you who have believed, do not approach prayer while intoxicated." Two narrations are recorded, in both of which Ali and Abd al-Rahman ibn Auf of the Muhajirun and Sa'd ibn Mu'ad of the Ansar are involved. Ibn Abi Hatim relates, "A man of the Ansar prepared food and invited some of the Muhajirun and some of the Ansar. We ate and drank until we became intoxicated. Then we began to boast. One man struck Sa'd with the jawbone of a camel, wounding his nose. This was before the prohibition of wine, and so the verse was revealed." Muslim records a longer version of this narration from Shubah. Another narration, also from Ibn Abi Hatim, relates, "Abd al-Rahman ibn Auf prepared food for us and invited us. He also served us wine, and as the drink took hold of us, the time for prayer arrived. One of us stood to lead, but in his drunkenness he recited, 'Say, O disbelievers, I do not worship what you worship, and we worship what you worship.' Thus the verse was revealed. O you who have believed, do not approach prayer while intoxicated until you know what you are saying." There is no need for further examples or accounts to illustrate the extent to which wine had permeated pre-Islamic society. It, alongside gambling, was among the most conspicuous and deeply entrenched traditions of that world. What then did the divine method do to combat this deeply rooted phenomenon? How did it confront this affliction, which renders society incapable of seriousness, righteousness, and awareness? How did it stand against a long-established custom tied not only to social traditions but also to economic interests? The divine method addressed all of this with but a few verses of the Qur'an, gradually, gently, and with deliberate patience. And it won the battle without war, without bloodshed, without sacrifice. The only thing spilled was the wine itself poured from its vessels, cast aside from the lips of drinkers the moment they heard the final decree. Not a drop was swallowed. In Mecca, where Islam had no state power, no authority save that of the Qur'an, there appeared in the midst of the Meccan revelations a fleeting allusion to Islam's stance on wine, discernible only through the delicate nuances of its phrasing. It was but a subtle indication. In Surah Al-Nahl it is mentioned, "And from the fruits of date palms and grapevines you derive intoxicants and good sustenance." Thus, intoxicants, the alcoholic beverage they used to produce from the fruits of date palms and grapevines, was placed in contrast to good sustenance, subtly indicating through this juxtaposition that intoxicants are one thing and good sustenance is another. It was but a gentle touch, a mere whisper to the nascent Muslim conscience. Yet, the habit of drinking, or, to be more precise, the custom of drinking, was far more deeply rooted than a mere personal indulgence. It was a social tradition, entrenched in economic realities. It was too deeply embedded to be shaken by a single admonition, however subtle. And in Medina, where Islam had established a state and held authority, it did not resort to the prohibition of alcohol through the coercive power of the state or the sword of the ruler. Rather, it was first and foremost the authority of the Qur'an. The divine method began its work with gentleness and ease, with deep wisdom and a profound understanding of the human soul and societal conditions. It commenced with the verse in Surah Al-Baqarah, responding to inquiries that reflected the first stirrings of an awakened conscience, questioning alcohol and gambling. They ask you concerning wine and gambling. Say, in them is great sin and some benefit for people, but their sin is greater than their benefit. This was the first knock upon the door, the first resonant call to the Muslim consciousness, stirring the Islamic soul and shaping the legal reasoning of the emerging faith. For within the framework of Islamic thought, the criterion for permissibility or prohibition, or even mere disapproval, hinges upon the preponderance of harm or benefit in any given matter. And if the harm of alcohol and gambling outweighs their benefit, then this is the turning point, the moment of decision. Yet the matter ran deeper still. Umar, may God be pleased with him, supplicated, "O God, grant us a clear and decisive ruling regarding alcohol." Umar, that name alone suffices to convey the depth of this tradition within the Arabian soul. Then events unfolded, events akin to those we have recounted, and another verse was revealed. "O you who have believed, Do not approach prayer while intoxicated until you know what you are saying. And so the divine method, wise and gentle, continued its course. This was an intermediate stage between the initial warning declaring that the sin of alcohol was greater than its benefit, and the final unequivocal prohibition which would declare it to be filth from the handiwork of Satan. The function of this intermediate stage was to sever the habit of drinking, to break the cycle of addiction. This was achieved by forbidding the consumption of alcohol near prayer times, and since the prayer times were distributed throughout the day, the intervals between them were not sufficient for an addict to drink to satisfaction, then recover from the ensuing stupor until they knew what they were saying. Moreover, drinking itself had its own rituals, its own set times, the morning drink, the evening drink, and these were now interrupted and obstructed by the prayer schedule. Here, the Muslim conscience stood at a crossroads between upholding prayer and indulging in drink. By this time, prayer had become the very pillar of life, and yet despite all this, Umar, whose very name was synonymous with resolute will, again supplicated, "O God, grant us a clear and decisive ruling regarding alcohol." Time passed, events unfolded, and then came the appointed moment, the moment decreed by the divine method for delivering the final decisive blow. The conclusive verses in Surah Al-Ma'idah were revealed. Indeed, intoxicants, gambling, sacrificing on stone altars to other than God, and divining arrows are but defilement from the work of Satan, so avoid them that you may be successful. Satan only seeks to cause between you animosity and hatred through intoxicants and gambling, and to avert you from the remembrance of God and from prayer. So will you not desist? And so the Muslims desisted, all of them. Wine jars were shattered, their contents spilled upon the streets. Barrels were broken in every corner. Those who had wine in their mouths at that very moment spat it out without swallowing a single drop upon hearing the command. They were drinking, yet they did not even complete their sip. Thus the Qur'an triumphed. The divine method prevailed. Its authority was established not through force, not through the coercion of the state, but through the power of conviction. But how? How did this come to pass? How was this miracle accomplished, this marvel unparalleled in human history, without precedent in the annals of legislation, governance, or law enforcement, in any place, at any time? It came to pass because the divine method took hold of the human soul in its own unique way. It seized the heart with the authority of God, with the fear of his displeasure, with the consciousness of his ever-watchful presence. It filled the soul with the reality of God so vividly, so intensely, that heedlessness could no longer find a moment's refuge. It grasped the human being as a whole, not in fragments. It addressed innate human nature as only the creator of that nature can. It filled the emptiness within with profound concerns too vast to allow for the intoxication of wine, the delusions of drunken stupor, the boasts and vanities woven in the haze of intoxication. It filled that void with a grand purpose, the task of guiding an entire lost humanity, wandering in the barren desert of Jahiliyyah to the verdant gardens of Islam, to its cool shade, its radiant light, its noble freedom, its vast expanse embracing both this world and the next. Above all, it filled that emptiness with faith so tender, so serene, so luminous, so exultant. No longer did the heart crave the intoxication of wine to lift it into false ecstasies, for it soared instead on the wings of true faith, ascending to the highest realms of divine light. It no longer sought the stupor of alcohol, for it had tasted the nearness of God, his radiance, his majesty. Having savoured this closeness, it recoiled from the foulness of wine, spurned its fleeting thrill, and found its very essence repulsed by its filth and the dull stupor it left in its wake. Thus did divine guidance rescue human nature from the wreckage of Jahiliyyah. It unlocked the soul with its rightful key, a key that no other can wield. It flowed through the veins and sinews of the human spirit, illuminating its depths, awakening it to life, cleansing it with purity, invigorating it with purpose, stirring it to noble endeavours, and calling it to the grand mission of stewardship upon the earth, according to the decree of the All-Knowing, the All-Wise, upon the covenant of God, in the light of his guidance. For intoxicants are like gambling, like all other frivolous distractions, like the obsession with so-called sports, and the reckless indulgence in their spectacles, like the mad pursuit of speed, like the infatuation with cinema, like the craze for fashion and fleeting trends, like the bizarre fascination with bullfighting. Like all the other absurdities that veil the lives of modern humanity, this new age of Jahiliyyah, the age of industrialized civilization, all these are but symptoms of spiritual emptiness of faith, first and foremost, and emptiness of noble aspirations that truly engage human energy. They are but signs of an exhausted civilization, bankrupt in its ability to fulfill the innate human yearning for meaning. It is this emptiness and this bankruptcy that drive people towards alcohol and gambling to fill the void, just as they drive them towards every other form of madness. It was not mere words that accomplished this unparalleled transformation. It was a method, a divine method, whose foundation was these very words, a method designed by the sustainer of all beings, not by fallible mortals. That is the essential difference between divine guidance and all human-devised ideologies, which ultimately lead to little of worth. It is not merely a matter of uttering words. Words are plentiful. A certain philosopher may write, or a certain poet, or a certain thinker, or even a certain ruler may compose words adorned and eloquent, appearing to formulate a system, a doctrine, or a philosophy. Yet the hearts of people receive them without authority, for God has not bestowed upon them any authority. It is the source of the word that grants it power and dominion beyond the inherent frailty, caprice, jahiliyyah, and limitation of human thought itself. When will those who strive to devise systems for human life, other than the way of the all-knowing, the all-aware, come to realize this simple truth? When will they desist from legislating rules for mankind other than those ordained by the wise, the all-seeing? When will they cease erecting signposts for humanity which were never established by the Creator, the Almighty? When? When will they abandon this arrogance? And so, we return from this digression to the noble verse, O you who have attained to faith, do not approach prayer while you are in a state of intoxication until you know what you are saying, nor while you are in a state of major impurity unless you are merely passing through until you have purified yourselves. Just as the verse forbade the believers from approaching prayer while intoxicated until they became conscious of their words, it likewise prohibited them from prayer while in a state of major impurity, except when merely passing through until they had performed the necessary purification. There are differing interpretations regarding the meaning of passing through and the precise nature of the prohibition against approaching prayer. Some hold that it refers to not drawing near the mosques nor remaining within them, while in a state of major impurity except for the purpose of passing through. It is known that some among the companions had doorways that opened directly into the mosque of the Messenger, peace and blessings be upon him, which served as their path to and from their homes. Thus, they were permitted to pass through the mosque while in a state of major impurity, though not to remain therein, nor of course to engage in prayer until they had purified themselves. Others interpret the prohibition as applying directly to the act of prayer itself, forbidding the one in a state of major impurity from performing it unless he were on a journey, in which case he would be allowed to enter the mosque and pray without performing the full ritual purification, but rather by resorting to tayammum, ritual purification with clean earth, which in such circumstances serves as a substitute for both ablution and full washing. The first interpretation appears stronger and more consistent, for the second, associating passing through with travel, would lead to unnecessary repetition within the same verse, since the condition of travel is explicitly mentioned later in the same passage. But if you're ill or on a journey, or one of you comes from relieving himself, or you have touched women and you find no water, then seek out clean earth and wipe your faces and hands with it. Truly, God is ever pardoning, ever forgiving. This passage encompasses the case of the traveller who experiences a major or minor state of impurity, necessitating either the full ritual washing or the lesser ablution for prayer. It equates his condition to that of the sick person who has suffered a major or minor impurity, or to one who has relieved himself and thus requires purification, or to one who has touched women. Regarding the phrase, or you have touched women, there are also differing interpretations. Some hold that it is a euphemism for conjugal relations, which necessitate full washing. Others argue that it refers to physical touch, in the literal sense, any contact between a man's body and a woman's, which according to some schools of thought invalidates ablution, while according to others it does not, depending on various considerations. 1. That any touch necessitates ablution, absolutely and without exception. 2. That touch requires ablution if it is of a nature to arouse desire in the one who touches, or if the one touched is of a nature to stir desire. 3. That touch necessitates ablution only if the person who touches perceives in his own estimation that the contact has aroused a reaction within him. 4. That touch never nullifies ablution, not even an embrace or a kiss between spouses. Each of these opinions has its foundation in either the sayings or actions of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, in accordance with the method of juristic disagreement over secondary legal matters. Yet what we find most convincing is that "or you have touched women" is indeed a euphemism for conjugal relations, which necessitate full washing. This interpretation spares us from delving into the various disagreements regarding ablution. In all of the aforementioned cases, whether the state of impurity requires full washing or just ablution when water is unavailable, or when it is present but its use would be harmful or impossible, tayammum suffices in place of both. The very name of this act is derived from the words of the verse, "Then seek out clean earth," that is intent to find a pure and wholesome surface of the earth. The term Sayyid refers to anything that is of the earth's substance, whether dust, stone, or even a wall. It includes even the fine dust that settles upon the back of an animal or upon a bed, so long as it is sufficient to leave traces when hands are struck upon it. The method of performing tayammum involves either a single strike of both palms upon a clean surface, followed by shaking off the dust and then wiping the face and hands up to the elbows, or 2 strikes, one for wiping the face and the other for the arms. There is no need to mention here the finer details of juristic disagreements beyond this, for this religion is one of ease, and nothing exemplifies this ease more clearly than the allowance of tayammum. Truly, God is ever pardoning, ever forgiving. This concluding statement is infused with the spirit of gentleness and grace, a reminder of divine compassion towards human weakness, a reassurance of leniency in the face of deficiency, and of forgiveness in moments of shortcoming. Before we conclude our reflection upon this verse and the lesson it imparts, let us pause to consider a few subtle insights contained within it. Let us contemplate the wisdom underlying the prescription of tayammum, seeking to discern, as much as God allows us, something of its deeper meaning. Some researchers into the wisdom of Islamic laws and acts of worship tend to rush into their explanations, presenting them in a way that suggests they have fully grasped all aspects of divine wisdom, leaving nothing beyond their reach. This, however, is not a sound approach when dealing with Quranic texts and sacred rulings, unless the wisdom is explicitly stated within the text itself. It is always more fitting to say, "This is what we have been able to glimpse of the wisdom in this verse or ruling," while acknowledging that there may yet be hidden secrets of divine wisdom that remain beyond our grasp. In this way, we keep our human intellect in its rightful place before the divine words and laws without excess, without deficiency. I say this because some among us, even those who are sincere, wish to present Islamic texts and rulings to people alongside a specific wisdom, derived either from human experience or from what modern science has uncovered. This is commendable, but only within limits, the very limits we have already pointed out in the preceding passage. It has often been said that the wisdom behind ablution before prayer is cleanliness. This may indeed be one of its intended meanings. Yet, to assert definitively that this alone is its purpose, to the exclusion of all others, is neither a sound nor a safe approach. For there came a time when some contentious minds declared that such a rudimentary practice was unnecessary, arguing that cleanliness is now readily available and incorporated into people's daily routines. If cleanliness were truly the sole purpose of ablution, they contended, then ablution itself would no longer be required for prayer. and, by extension, prayer itself would become unnecessary as well. Similarly, it has often been said that the wisdom behind prayer lies in its physical movements, which engage the entire body, or that it serves as a training in discipline, firstly through its fixed timings, secondly through its prescribed motions, and thirdly through the order of its rows and the leadership of the imam. Others have said that its purpose is the communion with God through supplication and recitation. Each of these explanations may contain some truth, yet to claim with certainty that any one of them or all of them together constitute the wisdom of prayer is to go beyond a sound methodology and a safe boundary. Indeed, there came a time when some people claimed that the bodily movements of prayer were unnecessary, since various athletic exercises now refined into an art were sufficient for physical well-being. Others argued that prayer was not needed as a means of instilling discipline, since military service provided the greatest form of discipline, rendering prayer redundant. Still others contended that the outward form of prayer was not essential, for communion with God could be achieved in solitude and privacy, away from bodily motions that might, in their view, distract from spiritual elevation. Thus, when we attempt to define the wisdom behind every act of worship and every legal ruling, and when we seek to rationalize them solely through human intellect or in accordance with modern science, and then insist that this alone is their purpose, we stray far from the proper approach to engaging with the divine revelations and rulings. We also step beyond the bounds of safety, opening the door to endless disputes, while exposing our interpretations to grave errors, particularly when we link them to scientific knowledge, which is in a constant state of flux, revising and correcting itself from day to day. Here, in our present discussion, the matter of tayammum, it becomes evident that the wisdom behind ablution or ritual washing is not merely cleanliness. If purification was solely about cleanliness, then its substitute, tayammum, would not fulfill this supposed wisdom. It follows, therefore, that there must be another purpose behind ablution and ritual washing, a purpose equally realized through tayammum. We do not wish to fall into the same error by asserting this with absolute certainty, yet we might suggest tentatively and with humility that one possible wisdom behind these acts is the psychological preparation for meeting God. The performance of a ritual that separates the worshipper from the distractions of daily life and ushers him into the presence of the Almighty. If this is so, then tayammum serves as a sufficient substitute for ablution or ritual washing in fulfilling this aspect of preparation. Beyond this lies the complete and boundless knowledge of God, the one who knows the innermost recesses of the soul, its hidden turns and unseen pathways which none but the most subtle and all-aware can perceive. And so we remain mindful of the need to cultivate reverence and humility before the most majestic, the most great, the most high. Once more we pause to reflect upon the divine emphasis placed upon prayer, upon its establishment in the face of all obstacles and hindrances, and upon the easing of these difficulties. The permissibility of tayammum in place of ablution or ritual washing, whether in the absence of water or when its use is harmful, or when the available water is needed for drinking and essential needs, or even during travel, in some interpretations, even when water is present. All of this demonstrates the profound concern of the divine way for the continuity of prayer. This concern becomes even more apparent later in the surah, where it is explained how prayer is to be conducted in times of fear, even on the battlefield. It is clear that the divine method insists that the Muslim must never abandon prayer for any reason whatsoever. This is further emphasized in cases of illness, where prayer is performed while seated or reclining, or even through mere gestures of the eyelids when bodily movements become too burdensome. It is this connection between the servant and his sustainer, this bond, that God does not wish the servant to sever. For he knows how much the servant needs it. For God is in no need of the worlds, and the worship of his servants adds nothing to his dominion. Rather, it is they who benefit from prayer, from communion with their sustainer, finding in it strength for their burdens, solace for their hearts, tranquility for their spirits, illumination for their beings, and the certainty that they are, under God's care, near to him, under his protection, and it is he alone who knows the nature of his creation, what suits their innate disposition, and what nurtures their well-being. For indeed he knows best who has created. He is the most subtle, the all-aware. We also pause to marvel at the exquisite expressions within this brief yet profound passage. Consider how the Qur'an refers to the act of relieving oneself by saying, "Or one of you comes from the place of relieving himself." It does not explicitly mention the act itself, but rather suffices with the return from the place where it occurred, an elegant and refined allusion. Moreover, the action is not attributed directly to the addressed audience. It does not say, "Or when you come from that place," but rather, "Or one of you comes from that place," adding another layer of subtlety and grace in speech, offering a model of refined discourse for human interactions. Consider also how the Quran describes what transpires between a man and a woman, using the phrase, "Or you have touched women." The word touch is more delicate, more modest, and more refined. It may serve as a veiled allusion to the act itself, or as a reference to its preliminary gestures. In either case, it exemplifies the etiquette that God teaches humanity in speaking about such matters, avoiding explicit expression unless necessity demands it. And observe how the Quran describes the pure earth used for tayammum as clean and good soil, suggesting that what is pure is also good, just as what is impure is vile. This is a subtle yet profound suggestion, gently permeating the consciousness of the listener. Glory be to the Creator of souls, the one who knows them best. Have you not seen those who were granted a share of the book, yet they purchase error and desire that you too stray from the right path? But God knows best who your enemies are, and sufficient is God as a protector, and sufficient is God as a helper. Among those who have declared themselves to be Jews, there are those who distort words from their proper context, saying, "We hear and we disobey," and "Hear, may you never hear," and "Listen to us," twisting their tongues and reviling the faith. But had they said instead, "We hear and we obey, and listen to us and regard us," it would have been far better for them and more upright. Yet God has cursed them for their denial of the truth, and so they believe only a little. O you who have been given the book, believe in what we have sent down, confirming that which is with you, before we obliterate faces and turn them backward, or curse them as we cursed the Sabbath breakers. And God's command is ever fulfilled. Indeed, God does not forgive associating partners with him, but he forgives anything less than that for whomever he wills. And whoever associates partners with God has indeed contrived a tremendous sin. Have you not seen those who ascribe purity to themselves? Nay, it is God who purifies whom he wills, and they shall not be wronged even as much as a thread on a date stone. Behold how they invent lies against God, and that alone is a manifest sin. Have you not seen those who were granted a share of the book? Yet they believe in baseless superstitions and false deities, and they say of those who disbelieve, "These are better guided on the path than those who believe." It is they whom God has cursed, and whomever God curses, you shall find no helper for him. Or do they have a share in the dominion? If that were so, they would not give people even as much as the speck on a date stone. Or do they envy others for what God has bestowed upon them out of his bounty? But indeed we granted the descendants of Abraham the book and wisdom, and we bestowed upon them a mighty kingdom. And some among them believed in it, while others turned away from it. And sufficient is hell as a blazing fire. Indeed, those who deny our signs, we shall soon cast them into a fire. Every time their skins are burned away, we shall replace them with new skins so that they may taste the punishment. Indeed, God is almighty, all-wise, but those who believe and do righteous deeds, we shall admit them into gardens beneath which rivers flow, wherein they shall abide forever. There they shall have purified spouses, and we shall grant them a shade most soothing. From this point in the surah, the battle that the Quran wages alongside the Muslim community begins against the surrounding forces of Jahiliyyah, and in particular against the Jews among the people of the book. This is the same battle whose scenes and arenas we have witnessed before in the surahs of Al-Baqarah and Al-Imran. The conflict remains unchanged, and the opposing forces remain the same, those very camps of hostility that we have already spoken of in our introduction to Surah Al-Baqarah, in our introduction to Surah Al-Imran, and again in our introduction to this surah. From this lesson onward, the external battle begins the battle between the Muslim community and the hostile forces surrounding it. But in truth, this is not the actual beginning of the struggle. Everything that preceded in this surah of social, economic, familial and moral regulations, of eradicating the remnants of Jahiliyyah from the newly formed Muslim society, which the divine methodology had lifted from the depths of pre-Islamic darkness, and of establishing and affirming the new Islamic identity in this community, all of that was, in reality, the true preparation for the external battle and the genuine groundwork for its confrontation. It was the battle of construction, the construction of this new society upon the foundations of the Islamic methodology so that it might stand firm against the adversarial societies surrounding it and ultimately surpass them. Just as we saw in Surahs Al-Baqarah and Al-Imran, the initial focus was on constructing this community from within, building its creed and its worldview, its ethics and emotions, its laws and social structures, while simultaneously educating the Muslim community about the nature of its enemies, their tactics and their schemes. It was warned of their deceptions and strategies, and it was guided toward engaging in this battle with hearts reassured, eyes wide open, wills strengthened, and a deep awareness of the nature of the struggle and the character of its adversaries. And so too do we find the same approach here in this surah. Throughout all of these surahs, the Qur'an was waging the battle alongside the Muslim community on every front, fighting it within hearts and minds, where it established a new creed, a new understanding of God, and a new perspective on existence. It erected new standards and established new values, rescuing the innate human disposition from the debris of Jahiliyyah, erasing its marks from the soul and society, and bringing forth the radiant and beautiful features of Islam. And then it led this community into battle against its lurking enemies, both within and without the Jews, the hypocrites, and the polytheists. The community was thus fully prepared to meet them and triumph over them, fortified by its newly found strength in faith, ethics, social cohesion, and organization. The true superiority of the Muslim society over the ignorant societies around it, including the Jewish community established in the heart of Medina, was not a superiority of sheer military power, nor of economic wealth, nor of material resources. Indeed, the adversaries of the Muslim camp were always greater in number, superior in weaponry, wealthier in resources, and more materially advanced, whether within the Arabian Peninsula or beyond it, in the era of the great Islamic conquests that followed. But the real advantage lay in its spiritual, moral, and social construction, an advantage that inevitably led to political and leadership primacy, an advantage rooted in the uniquely divine methodology of Islam. It was through this overwhelming superiority of spirit, ethics, and social order, and thus of politics and leadership, that Islam swept aside the forces of Jahiliyyah. First, it engulfed the Arabian Peninsula. Then it overwhelmed the two great empires that stretched around it, the empires of Persia and Byzantium. And after that, it spread to far corners of the earth. Whether accompanied by armies and swords or merely by the Qur'an and the call to prayer, its conquest was undeniable. Were it not for this unparalleled superiority, the world would never have witnessed the extraordinary phenomenon that followed, a phenomenon without precedent in history, even in the greatest military conquests, whether those of the Mongols in the past or the Nazi armies in the modern era. For this was not a mere military conquest. It was an intellectual, cultural, and civilizational conquest as well, one that demonstrated an overwhelming power capable of transforming without coercion the very beliefs, languages, traditions, and customs of entire peoples. Such a transformation has no parallel in any other military conquest, whether ancient or modern. It was a consummate triumph of humanity, a superiority in every aspect of human nature and its essential qualities. It marked the birth of a new kind of human being, one unlike anything the world had known before. And thus, wherever this tide of Islam flowed, it left its imprint, shaping the lands it touched and imprinting upon them its unique character. It overshadowed and absorbed the remnants of civilizations that had endured for centuries, like the pharaonic civilization of Egypt, the Babylonian and Assyrian civilizations of Iraq, and the Phoenician and Syriac civilizations of the Levant. For it was more deeply rooted in the innate nature of humankind, broader in its reach within the human soul, and grander in its foundations and objectives than all those civilizations. The dominance and permanence of the Islamic language in these lands is a phenomenon that has yet to receive the depth of study and reflection it deserves. To me, it is an even greater marvel than the spread and endurance of the Islamic creed itself. For language is so deeply embedded in human identity and so intricately woven into social life that to see it transformed in this manner is nothing short of a miracle. Yet, this is not merely a matter of the Arabic language, for Arabic existed before Islam, but it never wrought such a transformation anywhere on earth. That is why I call it the Islamic language, for the force that breathed new life into Arabic, granting it the power to perform this miracle, was none other than Islam itself. And likewise, the latent genius within the lands that were open to freedom, to light and to boundless expression turned towards articulating itself, not in its original tongues but in the new language, the language of this faith, the language of Islam. It produced in this language works of culture in every field, works imbued with authenticity, untouched by the strain of expressing themselves in a foreign tongue, one other than their mother tongue. Indeed, this language of Islam became, in truth, their mother tongue. For the wealth that this language carried was, first, vast in its magnitude, and second, so intimately intertwined with the very nature of the human soul that it was nearer and deeper to them than their old cultures and their ancient languages. This wealth was the wealth of faith and vision, the wealth of spiritual, intellectual, moral, and social edifice that the Islamic methodology had established in but a brief span of time. And it was of such magnitude, such depth, and such closeness to human nature that it endowed the language of Islam, with an authority that could not be resisted, just as it endowed the armies of Islam, with an authority that could not be withstood. Without this explanation, it would be difficult to comprehend that unique historical phenomenon. In any case, this is a subject whose full discussion would be long, but for now, let this glimpse suffice in the context of these reflections. From this lesson in this surah, the battle begins against the hostile camps lying in wait for the nascent Muslim community in Medina. In this lesson, there is a tone of astonishment at the ways of the Jews and their conduct in facing this new faith and the community that represents it. And in the lesson that follows, there is a clarification of the function of the Muslim community, the nature of its methodology, the definitive boundaries of Islam, and the condition of faith that sets apart its way of life, its existence, and its system. And in the lesson thereafter, there is a call to this community to defend its path, its position, and its very being, a revelation of the hypocrites hidden within it, and an exposition on the nature of life and death, and the divine decree that governs both this being part of the education and preparation of this community for its role and for the battle against its adversaries. In the following lesson, more discourse on the hypocrites unfolds, along with a warning to the Muslim community against division regarding them or defending their conduct. Then comes a detailed exposition of the measures by which the Muslim community is to deal with the various camps around it, an outline, in essence, of the principles of international relations. And in the lesson thereafter, we find an example of Islam's loftiness in its treatment of a single Jew within the Islamic society. The lesson that follows takes us on a journey against polytheism and the idolaters, undermining the very foundations upon which the pagan society in the Arabian Peninsula was built. Amidst this battle, there is a moment of internal organization, linked to the beginning of the surah in matters concerning the family. And then comes the final lesson in this part devoted to hypocrisy and the hypocrites casting them down to the lowest depths of the fire. These fleeting indications unveil to us the nature of the battlefield and its many facets, both within and without, and the intrinsic harmony and interconnection between the internal struggle and the external confrontation in the life of the first Islamic society. And indeed, this remains the very same struggle of the Muslim Ummah today and tomorrow, in its essence and in its truth. Have you not seen those who are given a portion of the book, who barter away guidance for error, desiring that you too may stray from the path? But God knows best who your enemies are, and sufficient is God as a protector, and sufficient is God as a helper. Among those who have declared themselves Jews, there are those who distort the words from their places, saying, "We hear and we disobey, and here may you never hear, and attend to us," twisting their tongues and reviling the faith. Had they but said, "We hear and we obey, and listen and look upon us with kindness," it would have been better for them and more upright. But God has cursed them for their disbelief, and so they believe only but a little. Here is the first of many instances of amazement at the stance of the people of the book, the Jews in particular. The address is directed to the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, or to all who witness this strange and dismaying stance. Have you not seen those who were given a portion of the book, who barter away guidance for error, desiring that you too may stray from the path? To be granted a portion of the book should have meant guidance, for God had bestowed upon them the Torah at the hands of Moses, peace be upon him, as a means to lead them out of their former misguidance. Yet they abandon this gift, they abandon divine guidance, and instead purchase error. The expression purchase conveys intent and purpose in the exchange. They have guidance in their hands, yet they discard it and take up error in its place, as though it were a deliberate transaction, done with knowledge, intent and full awareness, not out of jahiliyyah nor by mistake, nor through oversight. It is a strange and astonishing matter, one that rightfully invites wonder and dismay. But they do not stop at this strange and lamentable affair. Rather, they also seek to lead astray those who have found the path of guidance. They desire to mislead the Muslims through various means and schemes, some of which have already been mentioned in Surahs Al-Baqarah and Al-Imran, and others that will appear in this surah as well. They are not content with their own misguidance, which they have purchased. Rather, they seek to erase all traces of guidance from their surroundings, so that there remains neither guidance nor those who are guided. In this first glimpse, and again in the next, there is a warning to the Muslims, an alert to the deceptions and machinations of the Jews, and what a scheme it is. At the same time, there is an incitement within the hearts of the Muslims against those who wish to lead them astray after they have found their way. The Muslims cherished this guidance, and they bore enmity towards anyone who sought to return them to the jahiliyyah they had once known, the jahiliyyah they had come to despise after encountering Islam. They loved Islam, and they loathed every attempt to drag them back to even the slightest trace of their former ways. The Qur'an addressed them with this understanding, for God knew what lay within their hearts regarding this great matter. Thus, after exposing this Jewish attempt at misguidance, the Qur'an follows with an explicit declaration: "These are your enemies," and it reassures the Muslim community of God's guardianship and assistance against their schemes. But God knows best who your enemies are, and sufficient is God as a protector, and sufficient is God as a helper. Thus, enmity is proclaimed and made manifest between the Muslim community and the Jews of Medina, and the lines are drawn. At first, the astonishment was directed towards the people of the book in general, though it was understood that the intended group was the Jews of Medina, but the discourse does not stop at this general implication. Rather, it proceeds to specify the Jews explicitly, describing their conduct, their behavior, and their insolence towards the messenger, peace and blessings be upon him, during what appears to be the early years of his migration to Medina before their power was broken there. Among those who have declared themselves Jews, there are those who distort the words from their places, saying, "We hear and we disobey, and here may you never hear, and attend to us," twisting their tongues and reviling the faith. Such was their perversion, and such was their insolence towards God Almighty, that they distorted the words from their intended meanings. Most likely, this refers to their tendency to misinterpret the words of the Torah, altering their meanings to suit their whims so that they might deny the signs therein that attest to the final message, as well as the laws and commandments that the last scripture affirms, whose unity with the previous scriptures testifies to their single divine source, and thereby to the truth of the prophet's message, peace and blessings be upon him. The distortion of words from their intended meanings, so that they may accord with errant desires, is a phenomenon well observed among all religious men who deviate from the essence of their faith, turning it into a profession, a craft by which they seek the favour of those in power in every age and the approval of the masses who wish to cast off the restraints of religion. And among those most adept at this artifice are the Jews, though, in our time, there are among those who profess the faith of Islam some who rival them in this trait. Their crookedness and their discourtesy toward the messenger of God, may God's blessings and peace be upon him, reach such lengths that they would say unto him, "We hear, O Muhammad, what you say, but we disobey." Thus, they neither believed nor followed nor obeyed. This indicates that these verses were revealed in an early period when the Jews still had the audacity to confront the prophet, peace be upon him, in such a manner. And to their arrogance they added rudeness, deceit, and duplicity, for they would address the messenger, peace be upon him, saying, "Hear may you never hear, and consider us." In the outward wording, they appeared to be saying, "Listen," without commanding him to listen, which would have been a form of politeness, and "consider us," meaning, "Look upon us with care and regard, for we are people of the book, and should not be invited to Islam as the idolaters are." But in their twisted intent they meant, "Listen may you never hear, nor be one who listens, may God abase them." And as for "consider us," they would twist it to imply foolishness and stupidity. Thus arrogance and discourtesy, deceit and flattery, and the distortion of words from their rightful places and meanings, it is the way of the Jews. After recounting this of them, the Qur'an then sets forth the conduct befitting the people of the book, and the decorum worthy of those who have been granted a portion thereof. And despite all this, it entices them still with the hope of guidance, of good recompense, of divine grace and blessing, were they to return to the straight path, even as it lays bare their true nature, as it was and as it shall remain. Yet had they said, "We hear and we obey, and hear us and regard us," it would have been far better for them and more upright. But God has cursed them for their denial, and so they believe but little. For they do not face the truth with clarity, with openness, with integrity. Had they confronted it with such straightforward words, devoid of deception, "We hear and we obey," and "Hear us and regard us," this would have been better for them, more upright for their nature, their souls, and their condition. But the reality is that due to their disbelief, they have been cast out from God's guidance, and so only a few among them ever truly believe. And how true is God's word, for in all the long history of Islam, only a small number of Jews have entered into its fold, those whom God has granted goodness, whom he has willed to guide, for they earnestly sought the path of righteousness and strove toward the light of truth. As for the greater body of the Jews, they have remained for over 14 centuries a perpetual adversary to Islam and the Muslims from the time Islam neighboured them in Medina to this very moment. Their enmity toward Islam has been ceaseless, relentless, unyielding, taking on myriad forms, appearing in endless guises. And there has been no scheme plotted against Islam throughout its history, not even the machinations of global crusaderism, nor the various forms of imperialism, but that the Jews were behind it, or had a hand in it. Thereafter, the discourse turns to the people of the book, the Jews calling them to believe in the scripture that confirms what is with them, warning them of the doom and curse that await them should they persist in their obstinacy and transgressions, and branding them with the mark of idolatry and deviation from pure monotheism, the very foundation of their own faith. For God does not forgive the ascribing of partners unto him, even as he forgives all else to whomever he wills. And thus, the vastness of divine forgiveness is made plain. Even as the monstrosity of idolatry is laid bare, so grievous a crime that it lies beyond the bounds of mercy. O you who have been given the book, believe in what we have sent down, confirming that which is with you, before we obliterate faces and turn them backward, or curse them as we cursed the Sabbath breakers. And God's command is ever fulfilled. Truly God does not forgive the ascribing of partners unto him, but he forgives all else to whomever he wills. And whoever ascribes partners unto God has indeed committed an enormity of sin. It is a call addressed to them by the very title that should have made them the first to respond, by the very reason that should have made them the first to submit. O you who have been given the book, believe in what we have sent down, confirming that which is with you. For they have been given the book, and so this guidance should not be alien to them, and it is the very same God who granted them their scripture, who now calls them to faith in what he has sent down, confirming what is with them, so it should not be strange to them either. Indeed, it is a confirmation of what they already possess. Had faith been a matter of clear evidence, had it been determined by outward signs alone, then the Jews would have been the first to believe. But the Jews had their vested interests, their ambitions, their deep-seated resentments, and their obstinate defiance. And they were, by their very nature, a people of hardness and intransigence, just as their own Torah describes them as a stiff-necked people. And so they did not believe. And thus comes to them this severe, terrifying warning. Before we obliterate faces and turn them backward, or curse them as we curse the Sabbath breakers. And God's command is ever fulfilled. The obliteration of faces, the effacing of the features that distinguish their humanity, and the turning of them backward, compelling them to walk in reverse, may well be understood in the literal, material sense, that they would be stripped of their humanity, reduced to staggering backward, bereft of dignity. And likewise, the curse that befell the Sabbath breakers who, in their deceit, sought to circumvent the divine command against fishing on the Sabbath was their actual transformation into apes and swine. Or it may be that the intended meaning is the obliteration of the signs of guidance and insight from their hearts, their being cast back into disbelief and jahiliyyah to the state they were in before God had given them his book. For disbelief after faith and error after guidance is a true effacement of faces and sight, a turning back upon one's heels more grievous than any other. And whether this be the meaning or that, it is a dread and terrible threat, one that befits the coarse and unyielding nature of the Jews, just as it befits their vile and treacherous deeds.